Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagan here with a huge week of World War III analysis behind us. That's right, the Memorandum of Understanding between the United States and Iran, I guess, is no longer understood. It seems to have completely collapsed. The U.S. and Iran have had their largest exchange of fire since the April ceasefire initially began a few months ago that eventually resulted in the June Memorandum of Understanding. So we are in the midst, basically, of the collapse of the ceasefire. Many parties are desperately trying to get the U.S. and Iran back together. The Strait of Hormuz, of course, is the object of contention. So we're going to be breaking down all of the strikes that occurred across the Gulf, Jordan, all the other places. Israel not involved, funny enough, but of course, Israel is refusing to pull out of Lebanon. We're going to be discussing all of that, how Trump is pressuring them by offering Turkey F-35s, and of course, how all of this plays into many, many prophecies that it seems that this summer are very, very likely to be fulfilled, including the completion of the E65 highway in Greece and potentially the death of Erdogan himself. So we're going to be discussing all of that and so much more, everything going on in Russia, Ukraine, everything going on regarding the church as new persecutions emerge in Ukraine, in Estonia, and other places. So a really, really huge World War III update this week here in early July 2026. It's great to be here with you, Dmitry. How are you?
Doing well, Conrad. The news, however, not doing so well. As you've said, the Memorandum of Misunderstanding is well and truly continuously being misunderstood by, it appears, most of the parties involved, but certainly there are going to be abuses of the entire diplomatic process. Like we see this in Russia, Ukraine, and certainly between the US and Iran. There's some insane scheming going on behind the scenes, and diplomacy is basically being used as another form of weaponry. Essentially, it's like a soft power approach to bloodshed, which no doubt will again reaffirm itself now that we're almost basically a week after the 250th anniversary of the United States, the 4th of July, and absolutely the war is going to reignite, and well and truly we're on the cusp of that this week.
No, you're completely correct. Our predictions that Trump is desperately trying to get the 250th celebration of America's independence as well as the World Cup sort of behind him before we renew this war. And of course, the United States has now been eliminated from the World Cup. So even though in about a week and a half, 2 weeks, we will have seen the end of the Cup in the United States entirely, the U.S. is already out, so there's maybe less of a priority. But, we might see another week, 2 weeks of fumbling around, trying to come to another understanding. And then finally, that World Cup gets wrapped up. Trump, Hegseth, Witkoff, all of those people are going to settle back into the driver's seat with Netanyahu and get down to business as far as the bombings go. So we're going to break down all of that and so much more. But first, I want to remind everybody, of course, to subscribe at the Substack. If you like the show, if you like the weekly free World War III analysis, be sure to support us at worldwarnow.co. Of course, it's linked below no matter where you are listening to this. If you search World War Now on Substack, it should be the first thing that comes up. We are a top world politics Substack on that platform. So subscribe there, get behind the paywall to not only support the weekly World War III analysis, but also to get access to hundreds and hundreds of hours of our premium show called Ether Hours. So join the ranks of the Ether Pilled and listen to some incredible interviews, including our recent interview, the conclusion to our Rasputin series. That's right, 3 parts, 2.5 hours plus each, all about the true life, miracles, death, and veneration of Gregory Rasputin. Pretty much the most in-depth piece of analysis, or rather pieces of analysis on his life that currently exist in the English language, all with our good friend Alex from the incredible Rasputin Archive Substack. So check all of that out. It's linked down below. And if you get behind the paywall, you get access to all 3 episodes of the Rasputin series, as well as hundreds of our other episodes, including interviews with Father Peter Heers, our 2-part series with Gregory Heers about St. John Vitatsis, interviews with Jim Jatras, Mike Painovich, Father John Whiteford, a former member of the European Parliament, Nick Griffin, and of course, 3 interviews with former defense minister of Lebanon, Yaqub Saraf, devout Orthodox Christian, who, of course, we hope to have on the show again very, very soon. So get behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co and support us and get access to all of that incredible content. Be sure to check out antelopehillpublishing.com as well. Check out all of the book offerings that they have and use code WWN for 10% off at checkout. You can really get a lot of incredible selections there, banned books, censored books, new translations from all sorts of languages. So check that one out. I also want to encourage everybody to go to orthochristian.com and check out the 3rd part of my interview with Mother Cornelia, the main editor over at Ortho Christian, a very good friend of mine, a friend of the show. She interviewed me. The first 2 interviews were about my time in Moldova. Another interview was about Orthodoxy in America and sort of my journey towards it. And this 3rd part is all about my time in the Donbass, in the SMO zone in Ukraine. I talk all about nearly getting hit by a missile at a monastery church service outside of Donetsk. I talk all about interviewing priests and bishops and a whole host of other things. So you World War IX patriots are very familiar with my Donbass content, but this interview really cuts to the heart of a lot of it, and Mother Cornelia does a great job. So check that out. I also want to encourage everybody to check out our interview with Greg Reese. I know we previewed it on the previous episode, but it's been out for about a week now and is doing numbers. Everyone's saying how great and wonderful it is. So be sure to check out Greg Reese's Substack as well and our recent interview there. So again, thank you all so much for tuning in. I want to ask you all to like this episode, especially on Substack. If you're listening there, give us a like, leave a comment, let us know how you think the episode went, what you think is coming next in the ongoing Third World War before we dive in here. So again, thank you all so much for tuning in. It's good to have you with us here on this incredible journey. It's been so many weeks and years of World War now that as these prophecies are fulfilled and so many of these things happen, it's starting to feel, frankly, very surreal. I think you would agree, Dmitry. But let's get right down to brass tacks here. Of course, not only is the Memorandum of Understanding effectively gone and in the ground, it appears that these strikes that went on were the largest that have occurred in a very long time. Qatar came under strike for the first time in 3 months. We know that Iran and Qatar have generally gotten along. Qatar is one of the main pushers for negotiations, along with Pakistan, desperately trying to maintain peace in the Gulf. And of course, Qatari LNG is one of Iran's main targets that they could use to cripple the world energy market. So strike on Qatar, very symbolic in that regard. But most of the strikes targeted Kuwait and Bahrain, in particular, the Fifth Fleet headquarters there, as well as the Al Muwafaqat Air Base in Jordan was targeted. And of course, the Iranians continued to strike U.S. bases and Kurdish rebel forces in Iraqi Kurdistan. And this is from Dave DeCamp here. It says Iran's military on Thursday launched attacks on U.S. bases across the region following a second round of major U.S. airstrikes against Iran as the U.S. Memorandum of Understanding and the conflict has collapsed. According to Iran's press TV, the Iranian army initially launched a massive barrage of kamikaze drones targeting a Patriot missile system in Kuwait, a satellite antenna for early warnings in Qatar, and fuel depots belonging to the U.S. military in Bahrain. Later on Thursday, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced that it had targeted U.S. military bases in Jordan using 10 ballistic missiles, calling it a second wave of retaliation for the U.S. strikes. In our previous statement, we said that any repetition of aggression would expand our response to other enemy bases in the region, the IRGC said. In this second phase, we have made good on that threat against the aggressions of the child-killing American army. The IRGC added that the enemy's command and control center in West Asia and the Al Azraq air base in Jordan were crushed with 10 ballistic missiles, and said if there were any further U.S. attacks, the remaining U.S. bases in the region will not be spared from our heavy fire. For its part, Jordan said that its forces intercepted 8 missiles launched from Iran and claimed there were no casualties or damage. According to Iranian media, the 2 days of U.S. airstrikes killed 14 Iranian military personnel and civilians and wounded 78 others. Some of the strikes hit civilian infrastructure, including a railway line connecting Tehran to Mashhad and bridges in eastern Iran. U.S. Central Command said that its forces bombed 90 targets inside Iran in the second wave that began on Wednesday night. And of course, in the midst of all of this, when the bombing started, the entire Iranian government and delegation was in Iraq for the funeral procession of Ali Khamenei that went into Iraq and eventually made its way back to Mashhad, which again had this connection line damage, so potentially some of the crowd size was reduced. But nonetheless, I think it's up to 40 to 50 million people in Iraq and Iran total attended the funeral, so largest attended funeral in modern recorded history. But now that that has finally wrapped up, the Iranians at least have very few reasons why they wouldn't just retaliate and enter into this fight again. They don't have the World Cup like America still has looming over its head. And if you notice what I just read in that military sitrep, the IRGC was not the initial respondent to the U.S. aggression. It was actually the Artesh, like the actual Iranian army, when normally it's the IRGC Aerospace Forces, the IRGC Navy that does the responses, that strikes the ships in the Strait of Hormuz. That is, of course, what triggered this back and forth. Was the IRGC apparently struck a Cypriot, a Qatari, and I believe a Liberian flagged tankers, all three trying to pass through the Omani side of the Strait of Hormuz that the U.S. was using as escorts and trying to get as many ships across. As of right now, this is the most recent reports we have. Shipping activity through the Strait of Hormuz has fallen sharply, with only 22 vessel verified transits logged on Thursday. Just one vessel used the Omani Channel. The remainder transited via Iran's designated shipping lane. The figure marks a steep decline from the 40 to 50 weekly transits recorded in recent weeks, and a fraction of pre-war daily averages exceeding 100. Some ships are switching off transponders entirely, suggesting real traffic volumes may exceed what tracking data captures. The U.S. is claiming they've escorted hundreds of ships out of the strait and that the secret operation that they've been undergoing is still underway. But again, it's clear that the traffic has stopped dramatically, and right now the dispute is over total Iranian control over the strait, or whether or not there will be effectively free passage and navigation. CENTCOM has basically denied that they ever agreed to give Iran control of the strait, whereas Iran is insisting that the Memorandum of Understanding basically gave us joint control over the strait in the region. So that is currently the rub, as it were. And there were certain strikes actually in response to the Iranian attacks on Kuwait and Bahrain. There was a round of retaliations that were actually not conducted by the US or Israel or anyone you might expect. They were actually conducted by Bahrain and Kuwait. Some even claim Qatar might have participated as well, but I don't think so. I think it was a Bahraini-Kuwaiti operation that they did in retaliation, I guess, to the Iranian strikes. I guess they're trying to send a message to the Iranians that in the future, they will be joining in and lending whatever. Again, those countries are just extensions of the U.S. military. The idea that they actually pose any threat to Iran is very minimal, but I guess they're trying to be as pesky as they can. But at this point, the big question has now emerged on who's really calling the shots in Iran. We know that Mojtaba Khamenei obviously is in control, and that he has been very skeptical of these negotiations from the very beginning. And right now, again, as we're recording this, we may get news cooked pretty heavily. There are rumors of potential negotiations in Switzerland that the Iranians have since publicly denied. And since those denials, the U.S. has come out and said that there are now plans for a meeting on Saturday. We're recording this on Friday, July 10th, Dmitry. So the rumors are that on Saturday, there will now be an Iranian-U.S. meeting or indirect negotiations in Jordan, which again, the Iranians have not confirmed this at all. I think this is, again, more talk. All these sources are from Axios and these other places. Certain other sources like Reuters have recorded comments from Iranian diplomats saying that, there was rogue elements within the IRGC that launched those drones and missiles at the ships in the Strait of Hormuz passing through the Omani side that were trying to derail negotiations. So now the rumor is that more and more people in the IRGC are defecting. But again, the Artesh and the army immediately got involved in the retaliation. So now more Iranian patriotic pro-regime channels are saying that the army, the IRGC, and the people are now turning against Araghchi, Ghalibaf, and Pezeshkian in particular, who are trying to string along these negotiations with America that nobody supports. And we know that the supreme leader himself, Mojtaba Khamenei, who again refused to make any appearances at all at any of the prayers, any of the funeral processions for his father, Ali Khamenei, out of strict security protocol. But we did see the grandson of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the first Ayatollah, the first supreme leader of Iran, Syed Ali Khomeini, his grandson, on TV very openly saying, anyone who wants to negotiate in order to achieve peace with America is a traitor, and anyone who sends them messages of friendship has a foul and impure mouth. Our problem with America isn't an issue of today or yesterday. It started decades ago when they committed a coup against Iran. But with what they've done recently, the killing of Khamenei, they've planted a seed of enmity that will never go away. He then said, it is not permissible to rely on the people in times of crisis, and then when the situation calms down, say that these same people are hardliners and extremists. We must listen to the demands of the people. He's openly criticizing the government, Pezeshkian, Ghalibaf, Araghchi, for their, again, seeming desire to placate America and do everything they can to keep negotiations and communication channels alive, when it's clear that the U.S. has no intention of abiding even by the Memorandum of Understanding, let alone any kind of future deal, negotiations, anything that would resemble the JCPOA or anything like that. So one more thing before I get your perspective on the strikes, both from the U.S. as well as from Bahrain and Kuwait. Dmitry, Iran's foreign ministry on Thursday released a statement strongly condemning the latest U.S. airstrikes on Iran and said the attacks that allegedly hit 2 railway bridges are a blatant war crime. According to Iranian media, one U.S. strike hit an important railway bridge in Iran's northeastern Golestan province that links Iran to Turkmenistan and China. Iranian media also reported that a U.S. attack disrupted passenger train traffic between Tehran and Mashhad, a city in eastern Iran that's the hometown of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. Huge crowds have gathered in Mashhad as Khamenei's body has arrived in the city for his final burial. The Iranian Foreign Ministry said that it strongly condemned the aggressive attack carried out by the U.S. terrorist military in the early hours of Thursday, July 9th, against several locations in the southern coastal provinces, as well as 2 bridges in the eastern provinces along the railway route to the holy city of Mashhad. The ministry said that the attacks unquestionably constitute a grave war crime. So far, the U.S. military has neither confirmed nor denied targeting the railway bridges in northeastern Iran. U.S. Central Command claimed that its forces hit 90 targets, including air defense systems, coastal surveillance assets, missiles and drone storage sites, naval capabilities, and military logistics infrastructure along Iran's coastline. Iranian officials have said that the 2 days of U.S. strikes killed 14 Iranian military personnel and civilians and wounded 78 others. The attacks came after President Trump threatened that he could bomb bridges, energy infrastructure, and desalination plants in Iran. I would say in one day we can knock down every single bridge in Iran. There's not a thing they can do about it. Their electric and manufacturing facilities, they have desalination plants. We'll take them out if we have to. I'd hate to do that. That's probably the one I'd like to do the least, he said on Wednesday. And of course, that rail corridor that was struck, it is the part of the strategic China-Turkmenistan Iran corridor, the Akteke Khan railway bridge, specifically in Akala County. That's part of the Golistan province. The bridge formed part of a key rail corridor linking China, Turkmenistan, and Iran, a route that has become increasingly important since Russia began transporting goods through it last November, and freight traffic from China reportedly tripled amid the maritime blockade. The type of weapon used and the origin of the attack remain unclear. And again, so important to recognize those overland routes, because remember, we had George McMillan on even back in June 2025, right before Israel and the U.S. began the 12-day war and Operation Midnight Hammer, and he said that it's no coincidence they're doing this because many of these China, Iran, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan rail lines are being completed. They were completed in summer 2025. So they're making these strikes. One of the key components to fully blockade Iran is to make sure they have none of these overland abilities to ship oil specifically to China. And again, Iran is aware of this, and they fast-tracked 11 million barrels of oil out of Karg Island in particular, out of the strait, as they realized that Trump is re-threatening the blockade. They knew the Memorandum of Understanding was not likely to last for particularly long. And so they got 11 million barrels out. They're undoubtedly going to be trying to repair these rail lines connecting Turkmenistan, China, and elsewhere very, very soon, because it's clear that the blockade will be back, the Strait of Hormuz will be closed again, and the war will likely resume. I'd love your thoughts on all of that, Dmitry.
This has been an extremely violent week in Iran, and clearly the US has shown itself to, to be completely, so to speak, justified in line of Trump's plan of keeping the Navy intact, keeping all of their assets around the CENTCOM region, around that area surrounding Iran, for this exact scenario, for essentially to break out again into a new conflict, especially when Iran would again, according to the US's claim, attack, without provocation, these sort of commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz. But I think the most curious thing you just mentioned, Conrad, was the fact that the US's strikes were generally not even, so to speak, deep within Iran, around the capital cities of Isfahan or Tehran or Qom, but they were around the outside, even as far north as Golistan, along the south of the Caspian Sea, for example. There were explosions recorded as well in Chabahar, as well in the southeast. Clearly, Bandar Abbas was hit, and this sort of, in a way, shows that the US has almost complete dominance, air superiority. It can fly its planes somewhat, and again, the presumption is that the US Air Force flew along the Iranian-Pakistani border before it dropped off those bombs that targeted, again, the railway near Mashhad and some of those other key connecting points. Very similar to what happened on the 7th and 10th of April earlier this year, when there was intense bombing very deep inside of Iran. Many railways were hit, many bridges were destroyed, and it's almost even more, these raids, of course, they take place at night, and it's almost even somewhat more daring than what the Russians and Ukrainians are affording themselves in Eastern Europe, when, frankly, when you hear about the Russia, for example, dropping fab bombs on Ukrainian defensive formations, they are launching those fab bombs, so that these are not bombs in the World War II sense, but the plane has to fly directly over the target. These bombs they glide at the target. Some of them have GPS navigation, like the Storm Shadow missile, and you can actually launch them from a fair distance away, from a few hundred kilometers or miles, for example. That's what the US is doing, but the planes still need to fly somewhat deep into Iranian territory. So the question arises, Conrad, how did these US planes even get so far to actually strike the targets in northeastern portions of Iran, especially near a city of such significance around the time of the funeral procession in Mashhad? I mean, what does it say about the Iranian air defense, the surface-to-air defense missile systems, and the radars that they do have? Potentially, they are still somewhat depleted and not able to track some of those U.S. F-35 systems, because it's presumably the U.S. did not use the B-52s or any of their heavy bombers to carry out these raids, because in effect, these aerial raids took place almost less than 12 hours after the confrontation in the Straits of Hormuz, when those commercial vessels were allegedly, according to the US, put at risk. And again, CENTCOM's main statement, if you were to summarize it in one phrase, was basically the operation that the US undertook on the 7th and on the 7th and 8th of July was designed to further degrade Iran's ability to attack commercial shipping and innocent civilian mariners in the Straits of Hormuz. So an incredibly sort of biased, one-sided perspective on the entire conflict. Clearly, there were reasons why Iran struck those ships, and there was clearly reasons for it, but nobody sought an Iranian explanation. The US's approach to the Straits of Hormuz situation, the Memorandum of Understanding as it stands now, is simply to strike at Iranian targets first and ask questions later. It's a very sort of Western-style cowboy approach. Very interesting indeed, and perhaps the fact that 90 targets, according to CENTCOM and the Trump administration, were struck all across Iran, specifically in the northeast, all around of course, the border of Iran, Chabahar, Bandar Abbas, and all those other targets. Essentially, all around the perimeter of Iran, there were targets struck, notwithstanding the center of Iran was not really hit much. There's a sort of consideration that perhaps they were doing so because Trump at the time was actually stationed less than 550 miles away from the Iranian border. I suppose Trump was the closest to Iran, in the last few years. He was actually in Ankara, Turkey, and so this entire confrontation took place whilst there was a NATO summit taking place in a next door nation, which again is incredibly sort of, I suppose, very somewhat confident by Iran to actually challenge the Memorandum of Understanding or their interpretation of it. Again, it's like this legal diplomatic document in Iran is saying, no, the US is simply misreading what we've agreed to hear at this prior conference. And again, you're trying to essentially out-interpret an agreement that you signed with actors who are well and truly Talmudic. You have your Steve Witkoffs, your Jared Kushners, and all these other characters. These are the people you're dealing with. They've betrayed you at almost every other, handshake position throughout the diplomatic process, be it in 2025 during the 12-Day War or during the Purim War this year. I mean, you can't really trust these people. And so I think Iran at this point, Conrad, you're right, they've sort of understood, and the IRGC and the army, the military, the navy, the Iranian Air Force, armed no doubt with Sukhoi planes from Russia, understands that they need to be united around the idea that the US, the Navy is here to stay. The US Air Force units are still going to be running these raids whenever, of course, they receive a proper pretext in order to do so. And they need to be ready and united around the idea that, look, Iran, the only way it's going to secure their sovereign sea lane territory, specifically some sort of semblance of control over the Straits of Hormuz, similar to what Turkey has over the Gibraltar and the Bosphorus. Similar to what Turkey has control of the Dardanelles and Bosphorus Straits. The only way Iran's going to control that is, again, to ensure that it has some sort of military presence in the area. So again, it would mean to force the U.S. Navy to leave somehow. And again, Trump is emphasizing that the Memorandum of Understanding is basically on the brink. We saw, again, a major economic hit. We saw Brent crude oil jump up by 6%. EU stock market was hit quite severely by the escalation on the 7th and 8th of July. The only thing we really haven't really seen, I think, and this is quite curious, almost the bifurcation, splitting into two of the conflict involving the Memorandum of Understanding and the countries in the Middle East, is we didn't see Iran strike at Israel at all. Iran struck bases and locations associated with the U.S. CENTCOM command. Specifically, Israel wasn't struck. It's almost like Israel and Lebanon and Israel and Hezbollah are fighting out their own isolated conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean, not involving Iran and the U.S. So this Memorandum of Understanding will and truly has somewhat split off the two concurrent fighting sides and in a way has isolated the conflict somewhat. So that is, I think, incredibly curious. But yeah, Trump's statements that, there's allegedly assassination attempts being planned against him and he has a bloody plan prepared for Iran in case he is assassinated. These harken back to, again, some of the Thomas Crooks or whoever that character was allegedly trying to assassinate Donald J. Trump. All the claims that Iran was actually planning those assassination attempts in 2024 and so forth and so on. Again, some of the statements by J.D. Vance thereafter, all of these essentially black swan conspiracy theories that are going to be coming out of this, that Trump potentially is a target for Iran. It doesn't help, again, that the initial strikes against Iran killed all of those innocent people unrelated to the IRGC, unrelated to the military, that again have given rise to this insane ire and hatred towards the American people, Donald J. Trump, the American military. And so you do have these big posters. For example, you see those big placata in the city of Mashhad, which has said literally, "We will kill Donald J. Trump," and like a raised fist in the air. I mean, all of these particular statements, as reported by RT, in a way, from an Iranian perspective, somewhat justified, although you can see how incredibly agitatory they really are. And in fact, just like in Turkey, Conrad, we mentioned how the Turks really, the general civilian population really hates Israel. They hate Zionism. They hate the fact that their Sunni Muslim brothers are suffering. We can see the Iranian population well and truly. They will get behind Mojtaba Khamenei if he declares an absolute total war against the US and all of its proxies in the Middle East, like absolutely so. And we will see the war basically escalate to a point of no return. At the moment, we are still somewhat shuffling back and forth, shucking and jiving on this point of, well, maybe there will be meetings. And you're right, maybe the doves within the Iranian administration, I mean, they are losing power and prominence over time, but it's almost like even a meeting in Geneva or Davos or wherever they may be meeting in Switzerland potentially, or Jordan, for example, what kind of results can they really bring around? This will be the 8th or 9th round of negotiations between Iran and the US, and what can we really expect? Even if there are literally talks, the conflict can reignite at the exact point where Abbas Araghchi will shake hands with somebody like a Steve Witkoff. And we've seen this in the past. Literally, Abbas Araghchi is flying over to Iran whilst there are Tomahawk missiles flying at his own nation, and all the airports are shut down. Like this is where these talks get us absolutely nowhere. So the Memorandum of Understanding, well and truly, I have to agree with Trump, it well and truly is on the brink of being completely scrapped. And unfortunately, from the very beginning, as we said, Conrad, this was all basically a big fever dream because, look, Israel is still genociding the Lebanese people as we're speaking right now. And clearly the Lebanon conflict was just as important as the actual Straits of Hormuz subject.
100%. And we're going to discuss Lebanon in a second. The U.S. is desperately trying to juggle the Memorandum of Understanding, which calls for the ceasefire in Lebanon, and the new Lebanon Joseph Ayoun Israel deal that also sort of kind of calls for a ceasefire that gives Israel a lot more lateral movement. The U.S. forces, or rather a U.S. team, has been sent to litigate this. We're going to talk about that in a second. But you mentioned the Kurds, you mentioned the operations and whatnot that could be going down against Iran and Mojtaba Khamenei, what total war him declaring on might look like. If you listen to previous week of World War Now, we discussed the massive troop movements, the USS Boxer, the other amphibious landing ships with their marine amphibious landing forces and battalions on board, that again, more of those are in the region than ever, despite the Memorandum of Understanding that has now, again, been destroyed. So again, the U.S. has more land invading troops than ever before, so they have that. There's clearly something going on with the Kurds because the Iranians continue to strike them, but it seems to me that the Iranians have the number of any kind of operation that could occur. I mean, Trump keeps talking about needing to invade Karg Island. Just a few days ago, he said, we're really going to have to do it again, but they haven't done it because they know that it would be a horrible, horrible trap that would kill hundreds or even thousands of American soldiers. And again, we heard this from an Iranian field commander interviewed by Iranian media. He said, if the Kurdish groups, with the backing of the U.S. and Israel, try to infringe on Iranian sovereignty, we will not only push them back, we will establish a security zone of several kilometers. So again, we know that in January, the Kurds tried to incur into Iran. The Turks shared intelligence. They were successfully repelled entirely out of Iran. So now the Iranians are saying, if this happens again, we're going into Iraq and setting things up there for good. And again, if Israel's allowed to go into Syria and Lebanon for all of these things, then certainly Iran is allowed to go into Iraq to secure themselves and their borders against the fifth column that is the Kurds in the region that perpetually act on behalf of Israel and the United States. So that is the current status on the perimeter of Iran, of course. But the IDF Chief of Staff, Eyal Zamir, just again this past week, despite the fact that Israeli media is saying that it looks like, unfortunately, Iran and America this week are trying to return to the negotiating table, that did not stop Eyal Zamir for telling a group of graduating Israeli pilots on Thursday of this past week that the war with Iran is not over and to expect major operations against the Islamic Republic. On the drawing board are new plans. Major operations are still expected to lie ahead of us. Be prepared, Zamir said, according to the Times of Israel. Zamir's comments come after the Memorandum of Understanding between the U.S. and Iran to end the conflict collapsed, and the two sides are again trading strikes. While there's no sign yet that Israel has joined in, Iran could potentially target the bases in Israel from which U.S. military aircraft are operating. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz spoke at the same ceremony as Zamir and said that Israel was ready to strike Iran with greater force, something he said repeatedly in recent weeks as Israeli officials have made clear they were hoping for the collapse of the MOU. The army is ready and on alert for a resumption of fighting in order to regain air superiority and strike Iran again and to eliminate threats, including a third time if necessary, Katz said. We proved that the long arm of the Israeli Air Force can reach anywhere from Yemen to Iran, yet we must also acknowledge that the campaign is not over. If Israel does get involved in direct strikes on Iran, it will likely attempt to assassinate senior Iranian officials. The New York Times recently reported that the U.S. was worried Israel would assassinate Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf during negotiations back in April. Katz has also previously threatened to target Mojtaba Khamenei, who replaced his father as supreme leader after the senior Khamenei was killed on February 28th. the first day of the joint U.S. bombing campaign. And Dmitry, you mentioned the supposed Israeli intelligence talking about Iranian assassinations against Trump. And it is very funny how suddenly the Iranians always want to assassinate Trump the moment a memorandum or negotiations are occurring. And then suddenly, when the war is on again, it's like, oh, they don't want to assassinate Trump. Trump, hit him as hard as you can. It's very convenient for the Israelis. But again, in the midst of all of this, again, it shows you the real question is, I think, which Iranian media outlet is talking to who? Because I think those that are talking to Pezeshkian and Aragchi are going to be talking about, reining in the IRGC, getting people on the same page, returning to the negotiating table, whereas other sources that are talking to IRGC generals, Mojtaba Khamenei's people himself, and the other hardliners or people even just among the people of Iran themselves, they're, emphasizing how, oh, the Memorandum of Understanding is destroyed. We're completely done with negotiations. We're completely done with nuclear negotiations. And again, Ismail Bagaya and many of the people from the foreign ministry that aren't Abbas Araghchi themselves seem, again, more hardline against the memorandum than Araghchi and Pezeshkian, of course. And just recently, CNN has released exclusive satellite imagery showing that Iran has started rebuilding the Telecon 2 nuclear site in Parchin. Telecon 2 is a heavily fortified high explosive testing chamber suspected to have played an important part during Iran's covert Ahmad nuclear weapons program in the early 2000s. It was recently rapidly expanded before the recent war. And this comes the same day of these U.S. strikes that apparently targeted the perimeter of the Bashir nuclear plant. This is from Arab News. It says several areas in Bashir province were targeted today, including the perimeter of the nuclear power plant, a military base in the town of Chogadak, and a fishing pier in the south of the province. Ehsan Jahanian, deputy governor of the Bashir province, said, he added there were no reports of casualties so far. The United States targeted the perimeter of Iran's only civilian nuclear plant with a strike, Iranian state media reported, citing the deputy governor of the Bashir province. So again, getting very close to this Bashir plant, which again, this has been the only place that anybody has really been allowed into as far as these inspectors are concerned. And this is strictly civilian nuclear where Russian scientists are operating. And again, in the midst of all of this, Ismail Bagaya said inspectors will not be allowed access to the targeted nuclear sites, specifically talking about Isfahan, Natanz, and Fordo. And I don't know, maybe Bashir as well, now that it's been effectively targeted by U.S. strikes. He goes on and says UN Security Resolution 2231, which is the JCPOA, is now completely void. So again, I guess that means no IAEA inspectors will be making it into Iran anytime soon. So again, the entire point of the MOU was to set a stage for nuclear negotiations. So now they've said that we're not even allowing nuclear inspectors into the country. Why would the MOU even be resumed at this point? What would there be to talk about nuclear-wise? At this point, the ceasefire is over. Trump literally said the ceasefire is over, but we're trying to come back to negotiations. So he's trying to somehow piece together negotiations while they're just firing at each other. It's, again, all of this is exclusively relying. The only reason this hasn't erupted into war at this point is because it's clear that the three most powerful negotiators and the external facing factions in Iran, Pezeshkian, Ghalibaf, and Araghchi, they are pretty desperate for negotiations to conquer overall, whereas it seems that the people, the religious class, the Ayatollahs, as well as the supreme leader himself, and of course the IRGC, I think are getting sick of that. So it doesn't really matter how much Araghchi and Pezeshkian want it at this point. It seems that they are returning to war. And that's why I think we're getting all these reports of, oh, Switzerland, oh, Jordan, oh, maybe Qatar next, or who knows, or Pakistan again, because, Qatar and Pakistan are the ones trying to bring everyone to the negotiating table. But I guess at the end of the day, what matters is, what is the IRGC going to do? Are they going to keep firing on ships in the Strait, or are they going to actually allow the moderate delegation to do these things? And that is, this weekend might tell that tale. But we spoke about Iraq. We spoke about the Kurdish issue. We had this big statement here from the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, which is the coalition of Iran-aligned Shia militias. They released an official statement announcing they will not disarm, and they will in fact strengthen and expand their capabilities to confront the escalating Zionist American threats. They state that they will either attain victory by the grace of God or be martyred on the path of God. There are no other options, and their weapons will never be surrendered. This comes as the Iraqi authorities try to consolidate all of these militia groups into government militias, government military, the Iraqi army. And again, the Iraqi government is sympathetic and generally pro-Iran, but these militias clearly want to maintain their autonomy and pretty much have their only command structure be the Axis of Resistance command structure as set up by Qasem Soleimani, which is currently, operated by a series of more covert IRGC generals and colonels who interface with these Iraqi militias, Hezbollah, Ansar Allah, the Houthis in Yemen, and other forces like Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Palestine. So that's the status in Iraq. Again, Iraq potentially taking over Kuwait and becoming a big conflict thing with the Kurds and all of that. Iraq is going to play a big part, I think, in the things to come. Before I hand it over to you, Dmitry, we did have an update in Yemen. This was from earlier in the week on July 6th. It said overnight, Ansar Allah forces launched one of their largest assaults on the southern Al-Hodeidah front in years, attempting to capture Mount Dabas, a strategically important ridgeline held by pro-Hadi Yemeni National Resistance Forces, which are Saudi-backed. It says the battle lasted nearly 12 hours and marked the second major clash between pro-al-Houthi forces and NRF in the area within a matter of weeks. Supported by artillery and mortar fire, al-Houthi-backed forces launched repeated attacks in an effort to seize the high ground, but were ultimately repelled after suffering heavy losses. Mount Dabas remains under NRF control. The fighting comes amid rising tensions across Yemen, as large-scale mobilization is seen on both sides of the line of contact. So, before we move over to Levant and Palestine, Dmitry, what are your thoughts on Yemen? What are your thoughts on Iraq? And what are your thoughts on the nuclear situation in Iran, as it seems that the IRGC and Mojtaba Khamenei are, again, maybe 60, 70%, we don't know, going into this weekend. A lot of these things may get decided, so stay tuned to the World War Now channels, but it seems to me that it's probably destined to return to fighting. Maybe the U.S. will pretend to give concessions for another few weeks to get the World Cup final under their belts before really going all out, but I'd love your thoughts on all those things we just discussed.
Yeah, unfortunately, Conrad, we are looking at this really potent window of opportunity for the US and its allies to basically strike Iran into submission from roughly the 20th or 21st of July until, I would say, maybe a few weeks before the midterms in the US, which again would hopefully, I think the hope is that once the strikes on Iran do commence, once there are these amphibious operations that take place, the Straits of Hormuz will be entirely disarmed, demined, and entirely open for commercial trade so they can resume at full force. And that's, I think, somewhere in September, maybe even August, perhaps as late as October at the very least, there will be, again, a resumption of these strikes. And yes, what we saw this week was simply like a precursor of that. It will show you exactly what potential the US still has of bombing these, some of them quite deep targets within Iran, and the fact that there will be pretty much no... Yes, there will be, sure, diplomatic statements made by China and Russia. For example, earlier this year, we saw the bombing of the port on the South Caspian Sea in Bandar Anzali, where there were Russian ships allegedly close to being struck in the ports by, I believe it was either Israeli or American planes, in any case, and with no real consequence or difference there. But the Bushehr power plant potentially being taken out of order, the scientists evacuated from there, all the disruptions to Iranian-Russian bilateral relations and the complications therein, and of course the most important economic railways and roads leading from Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, all the way to China and connecting China to Iran. If all of these connections of Iran to its multipolar BRICS allies are severed at the same time, will there be a reaction? We didn't see really any foresight or anyone alluding to that at the BRICS summit earlier this year, which I think was extremely concerning for Iran. And maybe this is what, in some ways, Conrad, I think unfortunately justifies some of the dubs within the Iranian administration, because they can see, for example, certain rabbis around the Kremlin administration. They can see, for example, Trump's visit with Elon Musk and all these other big characters around U.S. capitalism visiting Beijing. They can see these multilateral relations, for example, the Ankara summit in Turkey. They can see Macron visiting Damascus this week, and they're saying, look, if we do engage with the US and Israel and the Gulf states, we may be alone against these much larger, much more powerful targets, and we will not receive the support we probably require in order to fight them off. And I think it's almost like a calculated position here. And yes, maybe they have their own arguments for it, but that's what I think potentially the peace, shall we say, the peace group within Iran is probably hoping. It's not that they're necessarily traitors to the cause of Iran, but I think they've calculated it in their minds like a chess game, and I think the only thing they can do is play the game out in not to be checkmated, but perhaps to have a draw carried out so that potentially some of Iran's sovereignty is left over so the country can at least rebuild itself into the future. So I do think there is some real threats to Iranian existence going forward. I think the U.S. still hasn't achieved some of its primary goals. It's like Trump and Netanyahu, they've spoken about this from the very beginning. And that's, as you said correctly, Conrad, it wasn't even about the Straits of Hormuz to begin with. It was around Iran's nuclear capabilities, which again are still unresolved. It's around Iran's funding of the Iraqi militias, Hezbollah, the Houthis, all these so-called, as the West and Israel calls them, paramilitary terrorist groups. They're going to be threatening Israel's future. All these things need to be again resolved, and ultimately, as Netanyahu has pointed out, many times, it's regime change in Iran that's the eventual goal. Whether it's the heir to the throne from the Pahlavi dynasty or somebody else, maybe some quasi-democratic government, that's the US's end goal. And yes, I think what this funeral has shown as well, Conrad, is that there's absolutely no way that this particular regime, having been victimized by unprecedented, without reason, without provocation, really strikes by Israel and the US, this regime right now is the only thing really holding Iran's honor up to actually protect itself and protect its own sovereignty. So there's no way the population will allow for this, 300,000, 400,000 strong IRGC elite to fall from the leadership of the country. It's simply, they're the only people actually keeping Iran's reputation standing in the world, in a similar way to how you have pretty much all of Russians, maybe save the very far left fringe liberals in a way, supporting Vladimir Putin in his war against Ukraine, because the entire world appears, especially the entire Western liberal world, is united against Russia, and this Russophobia is being spread completely without provocation around the world in such a large degree that if you do love Russia, you kind of have to stand behind Putin, even if you disagree with him and his politics. And it's the same thing here. Mojtaba Khamenei is now a symbol of renouncing all of the outside forces that wish to diminish Iran and to dishonor it and to have Iran pay out reparations. And unfortunately, Conrad, I do really think that once Israel deals with the Hezbollah issue, they're going to redirect their attention more eastwards, past Syria into Iran once again. And there will be most likely, obviously, maybe not ground operations, but there will be boots on the ground, and the boots on the ground will not belong to Israeli soldiers. They'll belong to white, Christian, mostly Protestant men. They'll be landing on those islands and putting themselves at insane risk against the heavily angered, basically very religiously and nationally motivated Iranian forces that are going to be fighting them back. And it's going to look much worse than Iraq and much worse than Afghanistan. In fact, most likely to be Afghanistan, and several times multiplied by that. So it's going to be absolutely horrendous, especially given the terrain is very, very similar, especially once you get past the coastal zones. So I don't see this ending anytime soon, unless somebody inside the Trump administration, Conrad, really points out to him that, look, you're going to need to resolve the Lebanon-Israel issue, and perhaps this will deter Iran from, pushing any more of their issues with the commercial shipping in the Straits of Hormuz. Maybe an understanding can be wrought there. Perhaps if we can end the Lebanese aggression by Israel, maybe Iran will ease off of the Straits of Hormuz. Very strict conditions that they seem to be promoting via their understanding of the Memorandum of Understanding. That's the only thing I think that could maybe de-escalate the situation. But again, there's this unfortunate 3-month window we're in now after the completion of the FIFA World Cup, which I think the Talmudic tribe and Trump's administration, the hawks within it, are going to absolutely abuse and utilize.
No, undoubtedly. And we're going to get into some interesting comments. Steve Witkoff reportedly told Bezalel Smotrich. So these people are not to be trusted. But this is from Anti-War. It said demolitions continue as Israeli Defense Minister rules out withdrawing from Lebanon. It says President Trump's declaration yesterday that Israel wanted to withdraw from Lebanon and his prediction that this would happen soon was echoed today by Ambassador Michael Issa, who said the framework was being implemented and Israel would start once a timetable was agreed to. They're seemingly the only ones who think so, however, as not only has Israel repeatedly insisted they intend to stay in Lebanon, among other occupied places, but Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz felt the need to issue a statement in the wake of Trump's comments to disavow them, insisting Israel doesn't need anyone else's permission to occupy Lebanon. We didn't ask for anyone's approval to enter Lebanon, and we don't need approval to stay in Lebanon. It is our right and duty to defend the residents of the Galilee and Israeli citizens, Katz's statement read, once again reiterating that Israel's posture within Lebanon had not changed, which per the statements they keep issuing roughly every 36 hours are an intention to remain. Underscoring that, Israel continued with demolition operations in southern Lebanon, destroying substantial portions of the village of Hula and Qiyam in explosions while shelling other parts of the Lebanese south. They further flew drones low over the Lebanese capital of Beirut. Israel has an explicit policy of trying to wipe out Shiite towns and villages near the Blue Line border, and recent satellite imagery points to them having effectively destroyed several such municipalities, with the destruction continuing apace. While a U.S. military delegation is apparently headed to Lebanon to try to prepare coordination for the trilateral agreement that was reached last week. In practice, however, neither that deal nor the others require Israel to actually withdraw from Lebanon, and they seem to be sticking to those terms. The UNIFIL continues to monitor the not ceasefire agreements and has reported recent increases in their own operational activities in southern Lebanon as villagers try to return to their homes after months of being displaced. Israeli Defense Minister Katz has repeatedly said some people will simply not be allowed to return. And again, this week, unfortunately, despite the supposed ceasefire, I believe Israel did take the Al-Dafir Heights, the heights of Al-Taher. I forget the name of what it is, near the Beaufort Castle. They took those heights from Hezbollah and the Lebanese forces. They continue to advance on the ground despite the supposed ceasefire. And the Lebanese government, of course, remains split on this deal. The previous article I read mentioned the U.S. delegation that has been sent to insist upon and to lobby for and monitor the ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel, ostensibly along the recent Joseph Aoun Israel agreement that basically gives Israel unilateral operations to do whatever they want if they feel threatened, to act self-defensively or whatever. Whereas the Memorandum of Understanding with the U.S. and Iran had demanded full Israeli withdrawal immediately. So in many ways, the U.S. probably wanted the MOU to withdraw while trying to keep the other Lebanon deal on the table, and then maybe get the Iranians back to the negotiating table again somehow, which again, this shows you why the quote-unquote hardliners are doing this. They're realizing that if they're getting us back to the negotiating table after doing all of this and everything's going on in Lebanon, they're never going to give us as much as what they gave us with the previous MOU. So we have to give them the stick. We have to go back in with force. But this is here also from Anti-War. It says high-profile protests over the Israel-Lebanon Framework Agreement reached late last month were initially dismissed by officials as primarily Hezbollah playing a spoiler, but substantial political opposition continues over what is being termed an unenforceable and potentially unconstitutional agreement. Hezbollah leader Naim Qassem is now predicting that framework agreement will totally fail to get parliamentary support, saying he believes not a single clause of the deal will actually pass. He added that the deal lacks national legitimacy and only serves the interest of the ongoing Israeli occupation. At odds are primarily the lack of calls for Israel to stop attacking Lebanon and the lack of a timetable for Israel to withdraw from Lebanon, or indeed any provision that suggests such a withdrawal has to ever occur. Many see it as a de facto surrender, formalizing the ongoing Israeli occupation and war, and that Israeli Premier Benjamin Netanyahu defended the deal on the grounds that it allowed Israel to stay in Lebanon as long as they wanted isn't helping matters. The terms generally shied away from using the term withdraw with respect to Israeli troops entirely, only talking of redeployments, which some are interpreting as Israeli troops simply shuffling around within the occupied South. Even those don't come with any timetables. Combined with the persistent reports of secret clauses in the deal that the government hasn't disclosed to the public, it's safe to say the deal has an uphill battle within Lebanon and is just the latest of several deals that fail to do anything about the ongoing war. So again, Israel has continued to strike across southern Lebanon, even as north as Baalbek and the Bekaa Valley in northern Lebanon. So the idea that Israel would abide by anything is, I think, absurd. And again, people say, like, why do these deals keep failing? None of these deals can work. It's because Israel. It's because Israel doesn't want them to work. Israel wants to annex southern Lebanon, everything south of the Litani River, bare minimum. So that's what's standing in the way. And any other analysis is just complete and total obfuscation. And in the midst of all of this, they continue to escalate in Gaza. We reported on the escalations in Gaza last week. And says here, Israeli strikes in Gaza on Thursday have killed at least 6 Palestinians as the IDF continues its constant violations of the U.S.-backed Gaza ceasefire deal. One of the strikes hit a vehicle in Gaza City, and according to the Quds News Network, the strike was an assassination attempt targeting Hamas spokesman Hazem Qassem, who survived the attack, though he sustained severe injuries. His companion, Mohammed al-Fayumi, was killed in the strike, and several Palestinians were wounded as the car was hit on a crowded street. Qassem was one of the Hamas officials who attended a press conference on Monday where the group announced it was dissolving its government in Gaza, a move seen as an effort to get the U.S. to pressure Israel to implement the Gaza ceasefire deal, but Israeli attacks have escalated since then. Qassem told AFP at the time that the purpose of the dissolution was to remove any pretext for the occupation, which continues its aggression and war of extermination. Another Israeli strike in Gaza on Thursday hit a group of civilians in southern Gaza west of the city of Khan Yunis, according to the Palestinian news agency Wafa. The attack killed at least 2 Palestinians and wounded several others. So the Gaza genocide continues, the Lebanese genocide continues, Israel continues to attempt to expand in all directions. And it says here earlier this week, Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich says he has prepared plans for the construction of 3 Israeli settlements in the northern Gaza Strip. And he also went on to say that Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, privately told him, "I will not let 2 million Nazis," referring to the Palestinians, "live next to your children along the border fence." So it seems that Smotrich has gotten assurances from the real estate Jew, Jared Kushner's friend and Trump's top envoy to both Russia and the Middle East, to ensure to him that the Palestinians will remain displaced and will go wherever the Jews want them to go. And we were talking about Hamas and how they dissolved. The other big news from Hamas this week is they are shifting its leadership, meetings, and headquarters from Qatar to Turkey. It says in recent months, the group has moved a significant portion of its political activities to Turkey after Qatar served as its primary political hub for years. And of course, we know that Qatar and Hamas headquarters in Qatar have been struck by Israel. That was one of the things that triggered one of the Iranian True Promise responses were these strikes. So obviously, Hamas moving to Turkey is going to be another reason for Israel to target Turkey. And another thing going on in Turkey, I tied this section all together with this. It says here, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan met with Prime Minister Nawaf Salam of Lebanon at the WWN mansion. The meeting addressed Turkey-Lebanon bilateral relations as well as regional issues, stating that Turkey values its relations with the brotherly country Lebanon. President Erdogan noted that he believes intensifying diplomatic contacts in this context would be beneficial, emphasizing that Turkey continues its diplomatic efforts to ensure Lebanon's security. President Erdogan said that he will continue to provide every possible support, including humanitarian assistance, to help establish security, peace, and stability in Lebanon. President Erdogan stressed that it would be beneficial for our region, for Lebanon and Syria, to develop good neighborly relations. President Erdogan also said that we are making every effort to further develop bilateral relations between Turkey and Lebanon. And of course, Israeli Energy Minister Eli Cohen said that if Turkey wants to establish military bases in Syria, then we will also establish bases there, talking about Israel. So again, you have Hamas moving to Turkey, Nawaf Salam, the Sunni prime minister of Lebanon, meeting with Erdogan, talking about the war, and you now have Israel and Turkey both threatening to establish military bases in Syria. Again, the prophecies are coming true, and everything we've been saying about Israel turning to Turkey is continuing to escalate. Obviously, we'll talk about the S-400 situation here next, but between the situation in Gaza, as Israel has no intentions of abiding by any of the U.S. plans, just like they have no intentions of abiding by those U.S. plans in Lebanon, Turkey is stepping in as the main force here. Obviously, Hezbollah and the Houthis and these Iraqi militias are the main ones fighting Israel right now with the Iranian support. But again, once this ramps up with Iran, and Iran is either pummeled so hard into submission, or there's some kind of new regime that takes over, or more hopefully, there's a new status quo that allows Iran to control the Strait of Hormuz, it's obvious that Turkey is going to be up next. And we're going to get into it in a second, of course, with assassination strikes potentially. I mean, look, the Israelis assassinated the head of Hamas when he was in Iran. They struck the Iranian embassy in Syria to kill IRGC and Axis of Resistance leaders that were there and facilitating contacts with Hezbollah and overland transit through Syria. Is it any surprise that they would take out Erdogan while he was flying over somewhere, or while he was potentially meeting with Hamas officials or something like that? It's not surprising to say at all. And it's clear that Smotrich is being allowed to speak about these settlements to make sure that Israel always has a very, very overextended hand, so that when it inevitably gets slapped down and they're asked to pull back by the United States, they only have to pull back a little bit. And they're already, they've already stolen 6 or 7 cookies out of the cookie jar by the time their hand gets slapped, as it were. So before we talk about Turkey and the whole F-35 situation, which might be one of the focuses of the show, Dmitry, what are your thoughts on Lebanon, Nawaf Salam, the deal there, and of course the situation in Palestine with the settlements and Hamas? It's quite the developing situation as Greater Israel is trying to be expanded and created.
Certainly. Look, it's an entire package deal we're receiving, specifically around the Sunni Muslim anti-Israeli, anti-Zionist coalition. Like, I anticipated initially after October 7th that perhaps it would be Egypt, maybe the GCC states that would formulate some sort of response to Israeli aggression against the innocent Muslim people of Palestine. But in fact, it's Turkey, this new sort of emerging power. And again, this was cemented by the fact that the Turkish revolution in Syria essentially, completely worked. The Turkish-backed head choppers, it was quite surprising that Turkey somehow found, whilst opposing the PKK, Marxist, Yazidi, and Sunni Muslim Kurdish terrorists, was actually completely fine supporting former members of Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. And in fact, it was Turkey that succeeded in December of 2024. And in fact, it was Turkey that pushed its agenda and probably continues to do so, consolidating power and sort of having this backdrop of legitimacy among the Sunni Muslim Ummah, in a way returning back to what we saw in the early 20th century of Turkey being the last Islamic caliphate. And to this day, it simply sort of remains that main inheritor of the, that particular the Rashidun Caliphate, the the people who followed Muhammad from the early years, like Turkey is the inheritor of that legacy. And so Turkey will continue to sort of push that. It seems like Erdogan is primarily, in fact, linking himself much closer with the Muslim Brotherhood. And again, this may be to his own detriment because, in fact, when we do have the Kemalist opposition coming to power, instead of hyperfixating on the Muslim Ummah aspect of the entire Middle East and sort of having Turkey come to the rescue of Sunni Muslim Lebanese citizens or the Palestinians, or perhaps pushing their agenda forward in Syria, it's going to be more or less a sort of secular Kemal Ataturk, very Masonic Turkish nationalism, a very sort of 20th century-esque, very Mussolini-esque Turkish hyper-hawkish aggression that's going to take over. And that, of course, will force itself upon the Greeks. Because notice, Conrad, in a way, Erdogan's main concern is, in fact, with the lands prior occupied by the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, because those are lands related to, Islamic holy sites, Damascus, be it Jerusalem and other places. He's not as much maybe concerned with the Greeks, as much as for the Kemalists, the main concern is for like the Ottoman Empire to expand like outwards, be it west, eastwards, instead of just to the south, because Islam is a secondary consideration for the Kemalist forces, whereas for Erdogan, Islam is primary, and this is probably why you have Hamas basically shifting its focus more into Ankara. And it's really curious how you had Donald J. Trump, Mark Rutte, the General Secretary of NATO, and all these other NATO leaders in Ankara, in the same city as Hamas, as the Hamas diplomatic corps. You can probably imagine just streets away from one another. And again, Turkish counterterrorism operatives are at the highest standards, so let's just not expect anything bad to happen in Ankara or Istanbul. If you recall, they've constantly caught Ukrainian terrorist operatives trying to transport explosives, and I think that at some point there was a truckload of C4 stopped in mid-2023, which was the Ukrainians were trying to bring that across the south end through Turkey, through the south end of the Black Sea, to blow up the Kerch Bridge, but from the eastern side rather than the western side. So completely these insane plans, and Turkey has thwarted that by basically through their counterterrorism operations. So in fact, Turkey may be one of the safest places in the Middle East in terms of their ability to thwart any sort of terror attacks. Their particular fights with the PKK can speak to that. So I do think, Nawaf Salam meeting up with Erdogan, Hamas again moving their focus to Turkey. Again, this is a double-edged sword, Conrad, because on one hand, Erdogan's relation with the GCC states, with the Sunni Muslim elites there, are becoming warmer because, again, him and the Qataris do see eye to eye. They are allies. Potentially, if the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia ever becomes more, shall we say, Islam-focused, especially when the Crown Prince comes to power, if he wants to reassert that particular heritage and legacy, they can find a common ground there. Maybe there will be like a quasi-Sunni Muslim, again, alliance built up from that. But we have to just keep in mind, Erdogan is making himself a target more and more by doing these things. And again, as you said correctly, the S-400 system debacle that will be discussed, I mean, this is probably the biggest story of the week, is incredibly important to this entire discourse, because if the most important thing is when, for example, the U.S. or its Western allies, or in this case, if Russia and Turkey ever go to war with one another, the most important thing is how many, for example, how many assets does for example, in the West, when the U.S. attacked Saddam Hussein, there was clearly an infiltration that they had into Saddam's air defense grid through the Thompson SCF, now Tails, air defense tracking system. So the U.S. had the codes, they had complete X-ray vision. They knew exactly where Saddam Hussein's radars were positioned all across Iraq, because they basically had the French defense firm that built those radar systems leak all of their history of trading with Saddam Hussein to the U.S. operatives. So the war of 1990, 1991 went really well. Erdogan, just how much dealing has he had with these NATO countries? How many secrets are they going to sell to Israel? And I think that Erdogan in some ways is almost anticipating maybe even a future conflict with Russia by handing over these, or potentially, trying to trade these S-400 systems to the GCC countries, because in some way, if Russia and Turkey ever have a confrontation in the future, Conrad, just think about the possibilities. Russia's going to know through some backdoor tracking devices, or perhaps through their own heat signature scanners, they will know exactly where those surface-to-air missile launchers are going to be located within Turkey, and they will be destroyed in the first week of the conflict. So just keeping all of that in mind, in some ways, Erdogan is almost preparing for this, 360-degree operation against any country that wishes to strike against them. And in some ways, I think he's almost like he's backing himself into a corner here. It's quite sad actually seeing how friendly, for example, the NATO countries were, him handing those revolvers as gifts to all of these leaders and hosting the entire NATO summit, knowing that there's all this rhetoric being built up against him, almost as if this was a last-ditch effort to try and have NATO kind of maybe step in for Erdogan and Turkey to try and show it as the civilized member of the European EU, NATO, at the North Atlantic coalition, and that Turkey is no threat to Israel. But in fact, I think Israel has been building up this anticipation of Turkey being the next bad guy after Iran, and that's not going away anytime soon. And I think, sadly for the Lebanese and Palestinian people, Conrad, in some ways, Turkey, despite the fact that they supported HTS, which again Hamas didn't really have a problem with, but it appears that Turkey is that last guardian that the Sunni Muslims may in fact have in the region. It's the only country that appears to give a damn or care, forgive the French, that there is any sort of incursion upon the lands of Lebanon, Syria, any sort of sovereignty is being struck. And in some ways, Conrad, this future conflict between the Turks, the Russians, and the Greeks is very unfortunate because Turkey, in fact, could be one of the only countries that could, regionally speaking, stop Israel dead in their tracks and prevent the greater Israel, sort of their messianic future from actually transpiring. And in some ways, Turkey may be the protagonist in this sort of Islamic story, but we know that Turkey will most likely overextend and, unfortunately strike at the Greeks instead. And probably this is the tragedy of the 21st century. This is the fact that the Turks could be this protagonist, right, in Middle Eastern geopolitics, and they in fact choose to make a very grave mistake. And I think that mistake, or at least the early fruits of it, will come around sometime soon.
I mean, the Turks are serious players here in the region. I mean, there's a reason Trump takes them as seriously, treats them the way he does. There's the reason the Israelis are scared and saber rattle against the Turks, and there's the reason why Russia wants to be friendly with the Turks. It's because I think so much of world history right now does hinge on the Turkish state. They're this bridge between Europe and Asia. It's very close to the center of the world island. They control the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits. They control obviously Constantinople. So it's very critical to the whole region, and they're 85 million people strong, second strongest army in NATO, huge navy. So their relative air defense power and air superiority with their fighter jets over Israel, over Russia, over the United States itself, potentially, obviously over Greece. These are some of the most important security questions that have to be answered at the global sphere and the global scale. So Trump, when he met with Erdogan this week, this is from PBS, he said, "We're going to be taking the sanctions off, okay?" Trump said in response to a question during a meeting with Erdogan at the presidential palace in Ankara. He said cabinet officials were working on the matter. Earlier in the meeting, he said the possibility of selling the F-35s to Turkey is certainly something we will consider. Trump and Erdogan repeatedly underscored their warm relationship as they met soon after the U.S. president arrived in Ankara for the NATO summit. Erdogan greeted the U.S. president with an elaborate welcome ceremony involving cannons, military officials on horseback, and jets flying overhead emitting red, white, and blue smoke. "Sometimes you get along with the toughest people like him," Trump said, gesturing to Erdogan. The U.S. president repeatedly praised Turkey for its loyalty to the U.S., particularly during the war in Iran. So the situation with the sanctions being removed, obviously the sanctions were applied to Turkey, who were part of the original 1999 program, actually, that brought the F-35 into development. They were sanctioned from receiving lots of this American military equipment because of their purchase of the surface-to-air missile 400 model from Russia, which is, of course, considered generally the most state-of-the-art, high-level missile defense system to currently exist. Still can't defend against hypersonics. Nothing akin to that exists at all. But the S-400 ostensibly is what protects Moscow and Russia and New Chersonesus and Crimea and these other places that come under fire. But the situation with the F-35s, people need to recognize it isn't just Trump glazing Erdogan and wanting to arm Turkey potentially again in a future war against Russia, which I think that's part of this, but this is most importantly a signal to Israel. Trump knows Israel does not want Turkey to have even these 5 sort of symbolic F-35s that Trump apparently is willing to give them. He thinks that he can use this. He's doing this the same time he sends his guys over to Lebanon to monitor the ceasefire situation. He thinks that Netanyahu, he can get him to pull out of Lebanon, to actually cease fire, to actually maybe not pull out entirely, but basically return to the status quo before the beginning of the Purim War by putting all this on the table for what he knows is their number one rival, Turkey. He's praising Erdogan and all these things publicly to get Israel to potentially do what he wants. And of course, remember, January 2026, Metropolitan Neophytos, we've read the statement in full on the show multiple times. He said, Trump is pumping Erdogan up. He wants him to go into these places. He wants him to go into Syria. He wants him to go into Iraq, and he wants him to do these things because he sees it as NATO expansion, and he gets along with Erdogan, and he sees it as something that would be obviously in his interest. And of course, that's part of the continuity of agenda with the Pentagon and NATO, that even without Trump, that's what I think they would want him to do. And again, with the Israeli bases and Turkish bases in Syria, we have to recognize that Syria is still very much an unsafe place. I mean, Macron was in Syria just this week meeting with al-Jawlani, and multiple explosions occurred near the hotel where he was staying. So again, the HTS regime has, in Damascus, of course, has not even entirely secured things there, whether it be ISIS or rogue regime elements or other people trying to disrupt the current regime, whether it be Druze or Shia elements. I mean, the whole country is still very, very much wild and untamed. And as we reported previous weeks and recently, ISIS is making a small comeback. They've been testing explosives in the deserts of Syria and have claimed that they are going to be making a comeback here, potentially even attacking Israel. So, maybe Israel is activating ISIS again to play the victim card. But in response to the S-400 situation, which again, one of the conditions obviously for this sanctions relief would be the Turkish sale of their 2 S-400 systems to an unknown Gulf state. People are speculating that it is either the UAE or Qatar. And I guess, Russia considers both those countries friends. So who knows what they think. But according to Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, the reported sale of Turkey's Russian-acquired S-400 system to a Gulf country is a super sensitive topic. He confirmed that Russia has had contacted Turkey on the matter and that communication will continue. So super sensitive doesn't really give too many details away. And it goes on, Turkey is seeking Russia's consent to transfer its S-400 air defense systems to a third country in an effort to clear the way for purchasing U.S.-made F-35 fighter jets. The proposal comes months after President Erdogan suggested returning the S-400 system to Russia, an idea that gained little support. Ankara also proposed keeping the S-400 while allowing U.S. oversight of its operation to address concerns that the system could compromise the F-35 stealth capabilities, but that proposal was also rejected by U.S. officials. The S-400 system remained in Turkey's inventory, but are currently not in operational use. So again, the U.S. is afraid that Turkey will figure out how to shoot down F-35s with S-400s, give that information to the Russians, and the Russians, I think, are afraid that the Turks will figure out, and the Americans will figure out how to evade S-400s and how to properly counter them. So in general, both sides have reasons to not want Turkey to reap the best of both worlds and have top-tier American stealth fighter jets and also have top-tier Russian air defenses that would disrupt the balance of power at a global scale far more than even putting Turkey over Israel. Because again, the idea that 5 F-35s actually give Turkey air superiority over Israel is silly, but having both of the sets of technology and the ability to test them against each other and leak information to one side or the other, that's what has these countries really, really worried. But of course, Greece is the country that comes under threat when we talk about all of this. Obviously, besides the eastern end of the Ottoman periphery, the Turkish periphery in Iraq and Armenia and Syria, places that the Ottoman Empire obviously used to expand out in that direction all the way down to Jerusalem. There is, of course, the prophecies that talk about the seizure of the Greek islands and how upon Erdogan's fall, the Turks will move against Greece and seize several islands, including Crete. But in Greece, the ruling party is debating, calling for early elections this fall. This is from Politico. It says Greece's political scene is bracing for a potential early showdown. New democracy, weakened by inflation, corruption scandals, and the fallout from a deadly rail disaster, is quietly weighing whether to pull the trigger on a snap election this fall rather than wait until 2027. The party still leads the polls, but its strategists fear that delaying could give the fragmented opposition, especially Alexis Tsipras's new Ilas party, time to gather strength. Inside the ruling party, senior officials say Mitsotakis has instructed ministries to wrap up their work by late August, keeping the option of a September or October vote open. Publicly, he insists election will be held in 2027, yet internal pressure is mounting. Advisors warn that moving early could prevent the opposition from reorganizing, while the socialist PASOK party continues to demand immediate elections. If Mitsotakis does go early, the likely timing would be after his September address at the Thessaloniki International Fair, a traditional stage for pre-election promises like tax cuts. Polls currently show no party near the threshold needed for a majority, meaning multiple rounds of voting may be required. Meanwhile, New Democracy appears to be positioning itself for campaign season. A mini cabinet reshuffle brought in younger hardline figures, signaling a shift to the right. The government also advanced legislation boosting salaries for senior Orthodox clergy, a move seen as appealing to conservative voters. Tsipras Elas party is already sharpening its message, framing the next election as a stark choice between corruption and integrity. And we covered last week the prank call from the Russian pranksters calling Mitsotaki's top advisor, who basically said that, yes, the elections will happen in September. And this is important. Why am I bringing this up? Because amidst the fall of Erdogan, amidst the seizure of the Greek islands, amidst these prophecies that are being fulfilled, the E65 highway coming to completion. I'll talk about that next. One of the other things that says is that the Greek government will basically enter into chaos. The people will basically overthrow the government. Politicians will be thrown out, and some kind of new, stronger leadership will rise up. I don't know if that means from the military. I don't know if this literally means St. John the Baptist will handpick people and emerge or what, but all of the prophecies talk about a sort of Greek crisis of government and a return to a stronger, more orthodox, more conservative government, not this nonsense globalism we've been getting from Mitsotakis and the quote unquote conservative New Democracy government that literally legalized gay marriage in Greece, becoming the first Orthodox country to have sodomite butt marriage on the books. But I speak of the E65 highway because many of these prophecies, the death of Erdogan, the invasion of several Greek islands, including Crete, will be fulfilled again in the midst of the completion of the end of this highway. And it says here, E65, the inauguration of the Kalambaka Gravena section is scheduled for July 23rd, with the Prime Minister in attendance. According to exclusive information from Radio Zigos, the new segment of the E65 motorway connecting Kalambaka with Gravena is set to be officially opened on July 23rd, marking the completion of yet another major infrastructure project for Western Thessaly and Western Macedonia. And this will effectively complete the full length of this E65 highway all the way from coastal Poland in the north all the way down to the Mediterranean Sea in Greece. And many prophecies from St. Paisios and others have spoken about this highway being completed. And we have other prophecies. Again, I heard this from monastics that I know myself, who I was spending some time with recently, but Holy Wisdom has also reported on this. It says here, Hierondissa Jerusalem of the Panagia Pantanassa Monastery, Nicosia, Cyprus, July 8th, 2026, said, Turkey, the hour has come. You must depart. It will be sudden. The Virgin Mary will step in front. And says, before the feast of the prophet Elijah, we must repent, although repentance is always timeless. In the Hierondissa's words, now it becomes urgent. And others, and at least on the new calendar, the date of the feast of St. Elias is, the 20th or the 21st of July or whenever it is, which again is almost exactly around the same time as the completion of the E65 highway. And then we got here another simultaneous piece of information that was given to Dr. Konstantinos Vardakas last night by his friend Elias, the teacher, a spiritual child of an Athenite elder, himself a spiritual child of saintly elder Ephraim of Arizona, received information from two of his own spiritual children who do not know each other. The Panagia appeared to them and said, now are the events. Converging pieces of information are something something is happening in heaven, something has been decided, while on earth the frenzy of sin prevails. And again, I also heard that, again, a spiritual child of Elder Ephraim from Philotheo, a pilgrim, Elder Ephraim, Yeron the Ephraim himself appeared to him and said that the Turks were coming. So I think the likelihood of things in 2026 really kicking up when it comes to the Aegean Sea and the Turks is getting more and more likely. And again, we know the prophecies. Eldris Galactia talks about the Turks will be forced to withdraw from Cyprus. There may be some brief fighting there, but they'll be forced to withdraw. Ultimately, they will go to Crete. They will go to several of the other islands, Rhodes, potentially Lesbos. We don't know how many it will be. If 3 is an exact number or several is just more of the general alignment of things. But again, if Erdogan goes to Libya or Syria or any of these places and is flying back, again, the likelihood of him being shot down, again, I was skeptical that it would come this soon. People can attest to earlier in the summer or earlier this year, but we're getting more and more of these words from different elders and people that I know are trustworthy in the Orthodox world. So undoubtedly, I think something is coming down the pipe here. And between the E65 highway and the escalations with Israel and Turkey and the US and the F-35s, it seems that things really are converging here in the summer of 2026. Dmitry, what are your thoughts on the prophetic timeline here?
No, I think it's incredibly telling. And look, the geopolitical analysis of many of the thinkers we quote on the show and the perspectives of even secular people distant from orthodoxy, it absolutely aligns with some of the clairvoyant sayings of the elders. And that's incredibly frightening because I think the anticipation is always, Conrad, that the enemy as well knows the clairvoyant sayings of the elders because they themselves in some way are trying to play up to those realities in the near future. And they themselves are not secular. They're not, for example, atheistic in their perspectives. They are not agnostics, but the sort of occult visionary timeline that they follow very much might align with what they see for the world, except the final result, of course, their particular eschatology definitely doesn't match with what the Orthodox Christian saints again foretell. And look, this is the sayings of, again, an Orthodox Christian from the Russian Orthodox Church is currently in prison. The former defense minister of Donetsk, Igor Strelkov, had quite a statement to make about the coming antagonisms between Russia and Turkey in the future war. And in particular, it relates to the recent strike of Ukraine on a compressor station for oil relating to the gas Blue Stream pipeline, which leads from Russia to Turkey through the Black Sea. And this is incredibly important because the Ukrainians, again, tried to strike this compressor station in Krasnodarsky Krai. This is, of course, on the eastern side of the Kerch Bridge, just across from Crimea. And again, this was incredibly provocative because it naturally strikes at the Turkish economic interests and, again, Turkish gas supply to Europe. But again, Ukrainians don't seem to care. And this is what Igor Strelkov had to say, and I'll quote him. Well, this is far from the first strike against infrastructure that transports oil and other products through Turkish territory to Europe. I do not think much will change. Turkey has long since diversified supplies to its own territory to meet its domestic needs. Moreover, it is repeatedly demonstrated quite openly that regardless of what Ukraine does against Russia, the Turks will calmly swallow it all. They will swallow these strikes as well because Turkey has a multi-scenario strategy that includes the possibility of a complete rupture of Russia and even military confrontation with it, given that the whole of NATO is confronting Russia and intends to continue to do so. Naturally, if forced to choose between Russia and NATO, Turkey will always choose NATO. And if the question arises of going to war against Russia, Turkey will fight against Russia. I have never doubted this, and I have no intention of doubting it in the future. Therefore, Ukraine is taking no risk at all by striking at the Krasnodar Krai compressor station and loses nothing by striking the Blue Stream pipeline and its infrastructure. By doing so, it is merely pushing Turkey towards a quicker break with Russia and the faster transition into the open camp of Russia's opponents. I mean, how poignant is that? So necessarily Ukraine, in some ways, and potentially being pushed by some of those CIA Delta Force operators or NATO advisors within Kiev, is actually trying to bring Russia and Turkey to a rift by agitating the situation around the Black Sea, be it through the gas, oil shipments, the pipeline itself, or maybe even the Bosphorus-Dardanelles Straits situation, which, again, Russian ships are currently being threatened in the Sea of Azov and across all of Russia, because this week, in fact, Conrad, there was the largest drone strike against Russia by the Ukrainians, over 700 drones, and just overall this week in total, the Russians shot down, and these numbers are again staggering, but if you consider that Ukraine produces close to 20,000 drones per day, they simply do not even have enough pilots or bombs to attach to those drones to fly them, but Russia has shot down over 5,000 UAVs, drones, just this week alone, over 100 aerial bombs, again fired, and these glide bombs dropped by Ukrainian F-16 and MiG planes and some of the old Soviet planes Ukraine has, as well as all these HIMARS missiles that the Russians have shot down. So the Ukrainians, in fact, are playing a pivotal role in trying to provoke this future, I guess, civilizational eschatological conflict between the Russians and the Ottomans. And I think it's just quite telling. It's almost as if NATO knows exactly what they're doing in Ukraine, despite the fact that the war between Russia and Ukraine looks like such a pivotal moment in the civilizational battle between East and West. Maybe that's just part of the puzzle. The greater war is yet to come further south of the Black Sea. And I think this is just the precursor in a way. And I think Igor Strelkov has a really keen vision of this. You remember his criticisms in the past about the Turks closing the straits and, again, sort of trapping the Russian armies both in Africa and in Syria. I mean, those realities are still on the table and on the cards going into the future. So whatever happens south in the Middle East, we just have to keep in mind the Russo-Ukrainian conflict is inherently tied to that, absolutely, be it by trade, be it by military intelligence, and naturally, and you can kind of see because of most diplomatic meetings between Russia and Ukraine from the very beginning, from 2022, they always took place in Turkey because, again, Turkey appears to play this middleman role. But I kind of side with Strelkov here. Eventually, I think Turkey will side with the one country that has essentially sponsored it throughout the 20th century, and that's, of course, the US, NATO, and those allies. Irrespective of, again, Israel's position, that's almost a different story altogether. So, again, incredibly tumultuous and very arrogant moves by the Ukrainians in trying to provoke this absolutely, I would say, cataclysmic battle between, you can almost say, two nuclear powers, because Turkey does have those nuclear warheads on their military bases supplied to it by NATO all those decades ago.
No, 100%. And again, the Black Sea is such an important battleground, and the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits. We're sort of getting a preview to that with the Strait of Hormuz. And I think the idea of the battle in Ukraine sort of ending with a whimper and not a bang, as it were. And again, maybe Russia being forced to take Crimea, Nikolaev, not Crimea, Odessa, Nikolaev, these places in the context of a broader conflict with Turkey, as opposed to part of this broad, protracted war that's been going on now for well over 4 years in eastern Ukraine. Again, it seems that, maybe eventually Zelensky will fall, he'll get voted out, maybe Russia will finally do strikes on major government headquarters. But as far as actually seizing territory and the major troop movements that we might be seeing here amidst the chaos of later this summer, I think it wouldn't surprise me if Ukraine ends up being just this long prologue to something much more intense. And I wanted to read some of these words from Elder Erothios, the cave dweller of Naxos. This was shared on the Holy Wisdom YouTube channel. He said, all the refineries existing in Crete will be hit immediately. There will be chaos, terrible chaos. And until they leave, the Greek army will pursue them with exhaustive and methodical search. Then they will have been cornered, and in retaliation, they will do harm wherever they pass. Where they found children, women, old people, and so on, there many people will be killed, as the elders Galactia said. He's talking about Turks on the Greek islands. He said, if you see Erdogan fall and others take over, the fights with the Turks will immediately begin, because Erdogan doesn't wage war like that deep down. But if the Kemalists get him out, in 10 to 15 days at most, they will strike all the borders they have with the Greeks, all the islands of Rhodes and the Dodecanese that are nearby. And everywhere they catch, because they want a small island to occupy, then they are entitled to an exclusive economic zone and control over oil and so on. And they will say, we want negotiations, and we too can take, let's say, Castelrizzo and half of it, so that we can have an exclusive economic zone too, and we will be forced to retreat. Meanwhile, this will also benefit the Americans, because the American companies that will come to do oil exploration, they will do the ancient Roman divide and conquer. You'll have a big American company, and it is in your interest as an American company and American government to exploit the oil and natural gas deposits that are being exploited. Let the Turks have half, let the Greeks have half, because that way you negotiate better. When they make war with us, they will close the Dardanelles Straits, and the Russians don't want that. The Russian wants to go for a walk in the Aegean like he's doing now. The Russians will ask to open them, but they won't. Then the Russian fleet will descend, and there will be disaster, because Turkey, which is a NATO country, will be attacked according to the NATO charter. All NATO countries are obligated to fight against Russia. That's 30 countries. The 1,000 ships, that is the Grand Armada that St. Cosmas the Aetolian used to say will gather, they will put a fleet there and so on. Because we Greeks will have a war with the Turks, that is, two NATO countries are fighting each other. The Greeks will not be able to send troops there. This is the NATO agreement. But all the other countries that are not at war with Turkey, since Turkey, a NATO country, will have been attacked by the Russians, they will pass through Greece and through other countries in order to hit the Russians. And because the GPS and all that will be broken, because in the event of war, telecommunications, ground stations are hit. If these big ones are destroyed, mobile phones cannot communicate with each other, because the satellite signal does not go directly to the mobile phone, but to transmitters. Since the world will not have mobile phones, because the Tower of Parnitha on a high mountain near Athens will be the first target to be hit, so that we won't have cell phones. Only phones with old-style cables will work. Any phone with fiber optics or mobile phones, you forget it. That's why NATO will pass through here. That's why St. Cosmas the Aetolian said, only 3 ports in western Greece can accept large NATO landing ships, Patras, Igoumenitsa, and Navarino. And all these cities are connected by roads. Let's say they all communicate with Egnatia Highway, and they will pass through 3 strategic passes in the Epirus region, and everyone will go out onto the Egnatia Odos, which is a road. And because the GPS will be broken and the army's GPS will be few, they will ask people, which way is Constantinople falling? Because if you know the other prophecies at this time, Constantinople will be in the midst of a massive battle between the Russians and the Turks and others. And St. Cosmas the Aetolian says, you will not tell them which way it is falling, because they are mercenaries. He says the mercenaries caused the greatest destruction, those Franks who came in 1254. And of course, 1254 was when Constantinople was sacked, and it fell and was eventually, retaken by St. John Vatatzis and his successors in the Empire of Nicaea. And they said Crusaders are mercenaries. Never mind how many women they raped and how many children. Never mind that they stole all the holy relics and took them to Venice, and the Venetians have them and they brag about it. So again, he's talking sort of about how the NATO rush towards Constantinople and Turkey and Russia will be sort of another land grab, another fourth crusade, as it were. So fascinating times in which we live. And again, Russia and the situation in Ukraine doesn't seem, again, we haven't heard anything about Russia-Ukraine negotiations in months. Literally everyone, Witkoff, I guess all of Trump's favorite Jews are too busy handling things in the Middle East. So we had to basically try to get people to forget about Russia-Ukraine. But on Thursday, the Kremlin responded to President Trump's comments about Ukraine's long-range drone attacks in Russia, which are supported by U.S. intelligence. At the NATO summit in Ankara, Trump acknowledged that the attacks are an escalation, but one that could lead to an end to the conflict. This is a misconception. Rising tensions and further escalation cannot contribute to a peace process in any way, said Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, according to Russia's TASS news agency. The more strikes the Kiev regime carries out on our infrastructure facilities, the wider the security zones we will need to create. Further escalation will likely prolong the special military operation to some extent, although I cannot say by how much, and it will certainly force us to create a broader buffer security zone, Peskov added. The Kremlin spokesman also responded to Trump suggesting he would be willing to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine as part of a security guarantee for a future plea deal. No one had previously raised the issue of closing the airspace. In any case, this would imply operational activities by NATO member states, armed forces over Ukrainian territory, Peskov said. This is precisely what the special military operation is intended to prevent. Trump also said at the summit that he would allow Ukraine to produce Patriot missiles, though actually establishing production is expected to take several years. Despite Trump's backing for Ukraine's long-range drone attacks and other escalations, Peskov said Russia still believes that the U.S. genuinely wants to end the war, while acknowledging discrepancies in the U.S. position. Still, unlike the Europeans, the United States maintains a willingness to help launch a peace process, even if it sometimes misunderstands certain issues and makes mistakes. We believe this willingness is genuine, and we welcome it, he said. So we get what's frankly the most clear exposition of strategy and plans from Peskov, explicitly saying they will be creating a broader buffer zone, and that the goal of the operation was to prevent NATO member states' armed forces operating within Ukrainian territory. He then goes on to also say, but the U.S. is goodwill and we want to keep negotiations open, which again, I think that's the attitude that is sort of holding back a lot of this escalation in Ukraine. And it will only take some kind of escalation from, frankly, an outside country like the Turks, after having witnessed whatever is to come with Iran, that will ultimately spur people within the Russian military, if not the Russian government and officials themselves, to act. So I would love to hear your thoughts on Peskov's statement there, Dmitry, those prophecies from Elder Erothios about Russia, Turkey, and Greece, and just in general, the latest from the front lines as Russia continues to solidify certain gains in key Donbas towns and advance despite the slow pace.
Yeah, it's curious because Peskov doesn't necessarily have his opinions. He's always voicing whatever Putin has already confirmed for him ahead of time. So in a way, Peskov is completely right. Like, Russia is still seeking to create a buffer zone. It's still seeking to potentially have some sort of mid to long-term ceasefire agreement with Ukraine, but it's on its own terms very strictly. And until that happens, Russia's going to continue pursuing these sort of, and again, at a snail pace, these progressions through the special military operations zone, taking all of these key cities as long as it's going to take. So specifically, like Konstantinovka being a good example, Putin announced a week and a half ago that city was taken, and well and truly, there's already the last remaining suburbs on the northwestern side of Konstantinovka are being cleared out by the Russians. There's roughly, about like a 1 kilometer square remaining of certain suburbs and blocks of Konstantinovka, which still have some Ukrainian operatives within them, but again, they're hiding in basements and things like that. Again, not surrendering. I don't think, surrendering to an enemy that has overwhelmed you is unfortunately in the Ukrainian tactic book at the moment, which is really unfortunate because a lot of innocent people, a lot of these forcibly recruited Ukrainian armsmen are actually being destroyed. Unlike, remember early on in the siege of Mariupol, for example, when a lot of Ukrainian commandos, they actually did begin surrendering to the Russians because they understood they would be treated fairly, and the purpose of the siege was essentially over because the city more or less has already fallen to the Russian side. I mean, for whatever reason, the Ukrainians have switched their strategies around. And it's really unfortunate. The sort of stubborn defense is causing more and more harm to the Ukrainians as they're sort of receiving these heavy bombardment strikes. For example, Krasny Liman was struck by 5 Fab 500 bombs. Yeah, so wherever the Ukrainians, the armed forces of Ukraine, really create these sort of fortified positions in areas unlike Kramatorsk-Slavyansk, but sort of these non-urban areas, any sort of villages, the Russians just, instead of clearing the village itself, they just assume the village is unpopulated of civilians and they drop a massive fab bomb onto the village from their Air Force. And again, the Russian Air Force is extremely wary of flying deep into Ukrainian territory because of those Patriot defense missile systems, so they presumably are quite comfortable striking at Krasny Liman. In Kharkiv, actually, on the territory of a village called Zaharovka, there were actually 4 additional fab bombs dropped this week. So you can kind of see the Russians are quite comfortable sort of not using tanks, just using frontline infantrymen as they take suburbs and villages step by step, being covered, of course, by intense swarms of drones. There are roughly between 5 to 10 drones per infantryman on the front line. So whenever you're moving forward with a small squad of like 4 to 5 4 to 5 men for clearance, that you can pretty much assume that your own side has 5 to 10 drones up ahead, sort of clearing the air for you or scanning and providing you intel onto the front lines. It's a very different style of warfare to the early years. Tanks aren't even being used anymore. And the last time we saw any sort of armored troop carriers being used was in the city of Mirnograd and Pokrovsk, and of course earlier Terezk as well. So even armed troop carriers aren't even being used. In fact, troops are mainly just moving on foot for several kilometers towards the battle zones. At nighttime, they're hiding during the day and then fighting and moving during night only. So the tactics are well and truly evolving and changing. But of course, unfortunately, the worst news from this week is probably the fact that there are actually the Ukrainians are effectively striking at a huge number of oil storage facilities, oil refineries all across the European side of Russia, including very key areas such as the Sea of Azov. The Ilsky oil refinery on the coast of the Azov Sea was hit. There was also the Azov 2 petroleum storage facility hit in the Krasnodarsky Krai, or I believe there were other oil refineries hit across Rostov. So any of these territories close to the Kerch Bridge, anywhere within essentially flight range of Ukrainian drones, the Ukrainians are comfortably striking at them. And, as you mentioned, Conrad, the Ukrainians not wanting a peace treaty with the Russians is kind of, it was foreshadowed by one of their their clear ballistic missile producers. This guy is, his last name is quite telling. So Denis Shtillerman, again, we mentioned him last week. He is the CEO of Firepoint. They produced a Flamingo missile FP5. And again, at the moment, they are producing the upgraded FP7 ballistic missile model that's going to be used to fire and essentially reach any target within 1,000 kilometers, roughly 700 or so miles outside of Ukraine's borders. And he basically said that the worst scenario for Ukraine would be a ceasefire at the moment, and it would be a very big gift for Russia. So in fact, you can see the Ukrainian sort of private military industrial complex, people like Shtillerman, who's an Ashkenazi, are of course going to be pushing for further Ukraine escalation because they understand for their own business interests it's good locally. Zelensky requires this to, push his own power model forward. There are, of course, oppositionary forces within Ukraine and outside of it. For example, Zaluzhny has released a really very long, prolonged article in the Telegraph and subsequent interviews. Zaluzhny has, in fact, somewhat criticized Syrskyi and Zelensky's approach to the war, and also has also commented on the fact that the war has reached a sort of prolonged state. And in fact, Zaluzhny, if you recall, he hasn't really had personal achievements himself. The greatest achievements he's, of course, had early on in the conflict was the retaking of cities like Kherson and Izium. So in fact, if you compare Syrskyi's track record to that of Zaluzhny in terms of armed forces of Ukraine, former leaders, Zaluzhny perhaps has a few more achievements than Syrskyi. He is, not without reason called the butcher of Ukraine for, sending men into the meat grinder as Ukraine recruits more and more of these people. But generally, the other really big story, again, for the Ukrainian armed forces comes from the NATO summit that took place in Ankara, because, again, the allies pledged, and in some ways Turkey also pledged, that over $70 billion in military equipment, assistance, training for Ukrainian soldiers, and to affirm Ukrainian sovereignty will be provided to Ukraine between 2026 at this point and 2027. So 70 billion, actually 70 billion, not US dollars, euros. So yes, Ukraine is continuing to receive this sort of unending international support, and I think any sort of hope, and some of the analysts have correctly said that, look, potentially Russia, through the prolonged war in Ukraine, is applying pressure on the transatlantic union, on the European Union, on the US-EU relations. But I think overall it's quite telling at the moment that these countries, a coalition built up against Russia, is quite comfortable to continue to print their way into an inflation of oblivion. And you can see this in Trump's move against the Strait of Hormuz as well, Conrad. The US and its allies, in order to benefit some sort of Talmudic international globalist interest, they're completely happy in tanking the entire Western global economy in, essentially pursuing their own needs, whether it's to subjugate Iran, whether it's to destroy Russia. And of course, I think some people really underestimate exactly how much pain the enemies of Russia and Iran are willing to take for, and how much damage they're willing to deal to their own economies before they achieve their own ends. So again, there is a sort of still solidified NATO stance behind Ukraine, and this is quite unfortunate because I think Dmitry Peskov and Lavrov, they're all realizing now that the spirit of anchorage is well and truly dead, and Russia again stands with the same allies that have been behind it from the very beginning. And the Trump administration is no friend. In fact, Trump administration is clearly antithetical to President Putin and the vision he has for the future of Novorossiya and Malorossiya. In fact, and it has been the fact from the very beginning. We've tried to sort of warn the Russians sort of listening to the show, but again, the reality is that the Kremlin really just focuses on its own messaging. So at the moment, I think, Conrad, there's a big strike of reality, as there are people in Moscow, for example, on the Mkad, one of the Moscow highways and other main roads, literally standing, waiting in line. Their cars are stretching out. I mean, I think the lines are as long as at least a kilometer long for petrol stations, because there is a real petrol diesel shortage happening in European Russia at the moment because the Ukrainians are hitting the Russians where it hurts. And the only retaliation, unfortunately, we've seen to this day is not a strike against decision-making centers within Ukraine, right? We are seeing the Russians, for some reason, are drone and missile striking, and even allegedly there's been some Zircon hypersonic missile strikes from the Russian Navy in the Black Sea against Ukrainian targets as well. But again, that's not exactly proven. Zircon missiles are very, very expensive, and the Russians have been using them very sparingly so far. So the Ukrainians claiming that the Russians are using these intense hypersonic cruise missiles from their ships is, I think, somewhat of an exaggeration. The Russians are probably using Iskanders and Kinzhals, most likely, but the Russians are striking at Ukrainian petrol stations across the country. So close to 4% of all petrol stations and gas stations across Ukraine are currently out of order. So it's almost like, if you'll strike at our energy, we'll strike at yours. But again, what's that going to resolve if the decision makers within the Bankovskaya Street in Kiev are going to remain in their positions, and they're going to continue pushing a hawkish agenda against Russia and the civilians in the SMO zones? So yeah, and continue to persecute the church, mind you. So again, I think some more radical actions will need to be taken by the Russians before they can bring this Ukrainian administration to heel.
100%. And again, the Russians need to be escalating like the Ukrainians are escalating. The Ukrainians took this to this energy war across all of Russia. You said just European Russia. Apparently there's lines out in Vladivostok, out in the Far East as well. So this is becoming a fully nationwide issue. Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak came out and talked to RAI and the Vosti, said a complete ban on the export of diesel fuel has been introduced in Russia. He announced this at a meeting between Putin and the government. This month, Russia will start importing fuel from other countries, he added. He also went on to say the situation on the domestic fuel market remains difficult, with demand for motor fuel having increased by about a third. They've also highlighted Crimea as the place that will be getting the most relief because, they were the first ones to experience these shortages even months ago, and now it's sort of becoming nationwide. So Crimea, I'd imagine it is a bit difficult, much more difficult than when I was there in November 2025. So crazy how things can change. And, Novak, this deputy prime minister, he himself is from Avdiivka in the former Ukraine, I guess, when it was part of course, the Soviet Union. So, these are people that should ostensibly be trying to get this thing wrapped up in Ukraine as soon as possible and liberate these territories. But alas, they seem to still want to play these games and wait for Trump to save them or whatever. Because again, what are they going to do when Trump doesn't even have Congress after the midterms? And what's he going to do after 2028 when the Democrats probably win, most likely, right? I mean, is that really their plan, is just to get saved by Trump? I think that is a little bit short-sighted. And as I've reiterated now, frankly, since some of the earliest episodes of the show, if we harken back to it, Dmitry, that the Russians will ultimately, by the forces of the world and fate and God, will be forced to take up their civilizational role and become the potentially begrudging liberators of Constantinople, Tsargrad. But of course, the Ukrainians, they are continuing to lose in many ways. It's not just territory and not just poor battle tactics, as Zaluzhny criticized Syrskyi and Zelensky for, but Ukraine has effectively exhausted its supply of Patriot PAC-3 interceptors, leaving Kiev with little ability to defend against Russian ballistic missile attacks. This is from the Kiev Independent. That says during Russia's latest large-scale strike, Ukrainian officials say 23 ballistic missiles and 6 Zircon hypersonic missiles, like you mentioned earlier, Dmitry, reached their targets. The shortage of interceptors comes as global demand for Patriot interceptors has surged, with U.S. inventories strained by commitments in the Middle East and elsewhere. As a result, Russia appears to be placing increasing emphasis on ballistic missile strikes against Ukrainian cities and critical infrastructure. So, Russia may be really hoping that this shortage of Patriot interceptors continues to facilitate gains on the battlefield and demilitarization, which again is still the central goal, I guess, of the special military operation. But again, running out of Patriot interceptors and successful long-range strikes with Zircon missiles does not take the city of Kharkov, does not take the city of Zaporozhye, does not take the city of Kherson, does not take the city of Dnipro, does not take any of these places, let alone Odessa. So again, there will need to be a ground strategy, and there will need to be political and military assassinations and probably fuller mobilizations and a broader strategy shift. Again, all the rumors are claiming that Belarus and Lukashenko are resisting Putin and Russia, apparently begging them to open a Belarusian front. I haven't really seen any evidence for that, but if they really were to try to wrap this up sooner, that would probably also be something that would be advisable, if not potentially necessary, to really secure what they need to secure with a strictly military option. So, with all of that, Dmitry, I'd love any final thoughts you have on the situation in Russia with the fuel, and if not, feel free to transition us to the Russian Africa Corps situation there, the other front Russia is fighting.
It's inherently related because a lot of the veterans coming in from, for example, the front line in Donetsk, for example, the veterans of the Bakhmut siege from Wagner actually joined the Africa Corps, and they came in. A lot of the interviews you see from the Africa Corps stationed in Mali, Burkina Faso, who are now fighting these Jenim Tuaregs and actually suffering some horrendous losses. In fact, ever since the death of Prigozhin and Dmitry Utkin, who again were largely in command along with other Wagner officers, and I mean, they didn't even have the term officers, they were more like leaders. They had their own ranking systems within Wagner. They actually carried out some successful operations within Mali, but now, ever since the death of those two leaders of Wagner, again, there was some downtrend in terms of the operations carried out very offensively in these regions, because it does seem, Conrad, as we spoke off air, in order to fight these Islamist savages in the Sahel and in North Africa, you actually need to have a bit of that sort of savagery yourself, just like the British Empire carried out its strikes in Sudan, for example, under Lord Kitchener, for example, against the dervishes, and all kinds of, other examples we can bring up in Southeast Asia when they are fighting against the Islamic terrorist, insurgent, or resistance forces, whatever you want to call it. Sometimes it's a very extreme means that need to be undertaken, because for whatever reason, it appears that Jenim and the Tuaregs, this strange alliance that they formulated, is actually very well coordinated. I mean, there's the front line stretch across Mali and into Burkina Faso is roughly, like, if you look at the front lines there, it stretches out up to about 1,500 kilometers long. So almost like the entire front line of Russia, the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It's a huge confrontation zone. The Mali military, it doesn't seem to be holding its own against these insurgent forces. Again, the savagery that's carried out against the civilians in Mali as well. So these particular Islamists, they don't beat around the bush when they begin, of course, taking hostages from local villages to keep the random settlers and villagers in line. They, of course, are completely comfortable in planting homemade bombs and mines on the roads potentially used by the Russian African Corps. And there is incredible footage from some of the night raid attacks by these particular people. They're not necessarily the most well trained, but there is some sort of upgrading going on in terms of their military strategies. And the news out of Mali at the moment, as of this week, is quite bad, in fact. And I do find it quite curious that Russia's still continuing to, in fact, sort of multitask in its foreign policy, Conrad. Whilst it's keeping one eye on, obviously, the Iran situation, very sensitive things going on there in the Middle East, that has its two bases still located in essentially a foreign enemy-occupied Syria, but the Russians are still trying to at least stretch out their arm into greater Africa, and just even beyond the Sahel. For example, Lavrov met with the Africa Union officials to discuss, again, African solidarity and Russia's involvement of so many African nations. Again, the Africa Union is just a very loose sort of networking option for all African countries, and Lavrov met with those officials. There's also an official sort of, I guess, collaboration that Russia is going to be striking with the country of Mozambique. So that's, of course, on the African mainland, just across from Madagascar. So very far from the Sahel, very far from those Islamist-occupied northern regions. But apparently Mozambique has been having its own Islamic insurgent issue that the Russians will be, again, trying to deal with. In particular, the reason why they're doing so is because Mozambique has been at least somewhat utilizing Russian LNG, liquefied natural gas technology, as well as there are massive, multinational firms like ExxonMobil, again, located on the coast of Mozambique. And of course, apparently Mozambique has these natural gas extractors. They, again, liquefy that natural gas. They freeze it. It turns into this like compact. They compactly store it. And again, Mozambique's, a lot of its economy is actually based on actually exporting that liquefied natural gas. And they need Russia's assistance in defending that energy infrastructure. And Russia apparently is very happy to help. So Russia is still somewhat involved in a lot of these national struggles. It's not necessarily spreading any ideology. Notice even with Wagner or the Russian Africa Corps located in the Sahel, Conrad, it's more about them simply keeping the regimes afloat. They're not pushing any sort of agenda. The Russian Exarchate, for example, in spreading its Orthodox Christianity is completely disconnected. And this was confirmed recently in some interviews because there were allegations thrown out that the Russian Exarchate is spreading Russian influence. But in fact, the Russian Exarchate and the Russian missionaries spreading Orthodoxy to the African peoples are doing so completely without state support. Like there was no funding for it. It's just the priests and the Moscow Patriarchate basically crowdfunding the spreading of Orthodoxy across Africa, whilst the Africa Corps and the military concerns for all these silver gold mines and to support these unfortunately failing regimes in Burkina Faso and Mali are acting basically on their own accord, according to Lavrov or whichever generals, Surovikin and others are involved in those particular military operations. But it is very sad, Conrad, seeing just another front line of Russia's interest. Similar to Assad's Syria in 2024, it looks like Mali may in fact be a country that is on the brink of collapse. And we recall in April of 2026, there were those absolutely massive and I would say most definitely coordinated attacks. Who knows? No doubt there are CIA operatives, maybe French intelligence, maybe Delta operatives, trying to at least work with the Islamists. Keep in mind, there were Delta operatives working literally with Al-Qaeda in Bosnia during the Yugoslavian civil war in the late 1990s. So just keep in mind, it's not like, unfortunately, these U.S. special operative forces are not allergic to working with Islamists. And it appears that the Tuareg-Janim alliances, strange as it may be, the Tuaregs are not naturally the Wahhabis by creed. They're happy to work together to completely dismantle the state of Mali. And it doesn't look like the Russians are going to remain in that country for very long, as there are rumors that they may in fact be retreating from the Sahel, which is incredibly unfortunate. And what can that say for like multipolarity, BRICS, and the ability of Russia as a major geopolitical power to nation build in some of these allied countries? I mean, it's not a very good track record, unfortunately, because they are fighting against a much larger, much wealthier enemy in the face of the United States, NATO, and their allies around the world.
100%. And obviously France got driven out of these countries by these juntas in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Guinea, in Niger, and these other places that used to be part of French West Africa. And, so the idea that they would be influencing JNIM and the FLA and these forces that have been participating in the nationwide offensive that started this past week in Mali, in the Goa and Afif, Aguelhok, Sevare, Kati, these are some of the areas that it began in. The Russians, they managed to hold a few positions, retake a few places, but they continue to retreat in Mali, holding less and less territory. It was a week and a half ago. They were already negotiating potential withdrawals from Bamako, the capital of Mali. So it seems that the African Corps, they've been more active in Central African Republic and these other places recently. I don't really know why. I mean, Central African Republic is even more of a war-torn crap hole than Mali. I don't really know what the interest is there. And you mentioned, the multipolarity, what this means for all of that. And I mean, I think, don't get me wrong, Dmitry, we do realpolitik on this channel, but I think we all support Russia, not at least here on this channel. We're not Haas multipolarists, these types of people. We are nationalist Orthodox Christians who are Europeans. And so we see Russia as a land military power that can, have a strong European Christian identity due to its population's ethnic core, not some kind of idealistic multipolar state that can help all these countries, meanwhile, not even being able to fully take its territory that it needs to in Ukraine. Maybe it's time to refocus, and you refocus, you pull out of these African places, and maybe you are more prepared to confront what's coming down the pike in Turkey and these other places. But again, I'm not saying Russia shouldn't do soft power. It's just you have to make sure you're succeeding on all fronts and not spreading yourself too thin. But when it comes to Africa, we have other updates here. A report published by the French newspaper Le Monde says satellite image analysis indicates the gradual construction of a military base in the city of Berbera in the self-declared region of Somaliland. According to the report, the project is being supported by the United Arab Emirates and is intended to serve the interests of the United States and Israel. So again, Somaliland right there across from Sana'a and Yemen and the Houthis, new base that Israel and the U.S. will be able to use, obviously against Iran as well, of course against the Houthis and against any other enemies in the Middle East that they may have. Of course, this is why Israel and the United Arab Emirates are the only two countries that have recognized Somaliland so far. So that's the situation in Africa. Not looking super great for multipolarity in Russia right now. It seems that NATO and the West is making another play in Africa. But of course, Libya is also something that I haven't heard too much news about recently, but I've heard the rumors, and the US is trying desperately to bring that situation back together. And again, Erdogan would obviously have to be a part of that. Turkey was always the number one supporters of the Tripoli based government there that was fighting against Khalifa Haftar. So Erdogan would undoubtedly be flying to Libya if that were to go on. And again, that's one of the potential prophecies and potentialities of him getting shot down, coming back from Libya, potentially by Israeli sources, even in Greek waters. Who knows? Because Israel recently did do joint air exercises with Israel on the island of Crete, which again only renders more legitimacy to the ideas that Crete and the prophecies that Crete will be one of the islands taken by Turkey. And moving on from Africa, not too much news from Cuba, but just in the past 5 days, 2 power outages affected the entire nation. So the entire nation was without power for several hours just over the course of the past 5 days. So again, the Russians don't seem to have succeeded in securing a fuel line to the Cubans in this regard. I don't know if they're just using the fuel for emergency purposes or continuing to ration, but it seems that Cuba is on the brink, and undoubtedly Trump wants to wrap things up in Iran and move over to that. And maybe he will try to get a quick victory in Cuba before Iran is wrapped up to try to get people back on his side, convince people that, America's still back. We're definitely not losing wars, but, who really knows? Other miscellaneous news before we move on to some church news is that National Rally leader Marine Le Pen, French right-wing party leader, was sentenced to 3 years in prison, 2 of which are suspended, and a fine of 100,000 euros. The 1 year of prison will be spent under house arrest with an electronic bracelet. The court reduced her ineligibility from 5 years to 45 months, of which she already spent 30 months. She was not made ineligible to run for French president, but she previously said she won't run if she has an ankle monitor. And in response to that, Marine Le Pen announced she is running a ticket with Jordan Bardella, openly saying he would become prime minister if she wins the presidential election. Such a strategy has not been used in France since 1969. So again, everyone thought Bardella would maybe run on his own to lead National Rally and become president of France, but it seems that they're running a presidential prime minister ticket. Not sure how she's going to win when she can't travel around a campaign and will have to stay in her house with an ankle monitor. But again, both of these people are intensely philo-Semitic. They've come out in support of Israel strongly in this war with Iran, and they've always used the sort of anti-jihad rhetoric when it comes to the Great Replacement and Islamism. They've leaned against the racial sides of it and are just more into hating on Muslims and being extremely pro-Jewish. So not a whole lot of promising future in the French right wing, but I'd love your thoughts on anything else going on in Africa, Dmitry, Cuba, France, Europe, any other miscellaneous items you have before we get to church news.
Yeah, I think it's very disrespectful. Like Macron's recent visit to Syria, there was a lot of French nationalists actually commenting on it, and just the fact that, if you remember all the Islamic attacks on French territory from ISIS, from members of Al Qaeda. I mean, Macron just showing a complete disrespect to his heritage. It's just really curious. In some ways, it is somewhat similar to Russian officials welcoming some Afghan insurgents and, of course, recognizing the Taliban as well in Afghanistan, given that there are still Russian veterans well and truly alive who fought against that exact force and their predecessors during the Soviet years in the 1970s and 80s. But, it's not exactly one-to-one aligned, but there is this strange history of like European powers somewhat forgiving their former enemies and again moving on in sort of allyship, going forward. So I just find that quite curious. But in terms of church news, I think there's been some unfortunate developments that a lot of the times when we speak of Mount Athos, Conrad, we speak about like the good news coming out of it, the solidarity around the clairvoyant saints and their sayings, but there are some monasteries within Mount Athos. We don't have to name them on every episode, but there's a good portion of them, maybe close to 40%, maybe half, that do recognize, unfortunately, the Ukrainian schismatics, and they do follow along sort of in the footsteps of their patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople, Istanbul. Specifically, this was evidenced recently. This week, Archimandrite Bartholomew of the new Esphigmenou monastery visited Kiev, and this is really concerning because he met specifically with Epiphany Dumenko, of course, the false Metropolitan of Kiev. He did not meet with Metropolitan Onufri, which, again, super disrespectful, because he could have at least, if the Saffanite Archimandrite wanted to, be some sort of peacekeeper in the role, he would meet with both metropolitans. Clearly, Metropolitan Onufri has been well and truly active long even before maybe even this Archimandrite became the leader of his respective monastery, and yet, there's this particular Athenite community continues to disrespect the long-standing traditions of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and so he met with them at specifically the Dormition Cathedral in the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, which has recently been forcibly taken over. This cathedral has been desecrated several times by all kinds of, ecumenist services, events, funerals of quasi, if not non-Orthodox entities and people. This cathedral essentially would need to be reconsecrated at some soon established time, hopefully when it's liberated. But yet, the largest cathedral of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra is like almost this meeting place of like demons and ecumenists, and unfortunately, Archimandrite Bartholomew has been, actively participating in this particular Sabbath. So, in this particular unholy meeting with Sergei Domenko, in other news from Ukraine, it sort of shows you that not all the hierarchs are taking this position that Russia is the bad guy. There are still some hierarchs and those very close to Metropolitan Onufri. I think in some ways they do reflect the actual position of Metropolitan Onufri, but publicly he can't say so because of the pressure that he's facing from Zelensky's terrorist government. And you have to just keep in mind, Zelensky's government has assassinated so many people. They've basically assaulted so many Orthodox bishops, and Metropolitan Onufri has to remain essentially afloat and in control of his administration of the church and outside of prison for all of this to move ahead. Keep in mind, remember, Metropolitan Onufri's Ukrainian citizenship has also been revoked, so I'm not even sure about his status within the country itself. It's just incredibly strange and concerning. But Metropolitan Anthony Pakanich, he's the secretary of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Synod, a very, very important person, I would say. And look, this is just my guess, but into the future, after Metropolitan Onufri's repose, no doubt Anthony Pakanich will become the new Metropolitan of Kiev, of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. I have no doubt about that. He's just very well positioned, very, very balanced. He's incredibly diplomatic. He reminds me very much of Patriarch Kirill, but like a Ukrainian version. So he's super well spoken. He's quite young as well. I believe he's in his early 50s. And recently he had to comment on the fact that Ukraine is moving closer towards some sort of EU integration, not NATO, but specifically with the EU, economically speaking. And this sort of coincides with the fact that Romania and Moldova want to link up and unite, and the fact that, in some ways, even Putin himself has mentioned that, look, he doesn't see it as troublesome for Ukraine to become more integrated with the EU at all. It's more the concern is about NATO and Ukraine's militarization and the future of that. But Anthony Pakanich specifically, this metropolitan, he pointed out that basically Ukraine should not accept the EU until the EU's values change. She said the whole LGBTQization, the liberalization of society, Ukrainians need to oppose that, and that cannot be imposed upon the Ukrainian people. And he's speaking to a population which has been, who knows what the diminishment of the Ukrainian population is overall. They may have lost 30 to 40% of their population to warfare, asylum seekers, Ukrainians just leaving the country. The population of Ukraine is, at the moment, what it's currently standing at is a big question mark. But Metropolitan Anthony is basically saying, look, we should not seek economic prosperity at the cost of our culture, of our spiritual well-being, and we should not seek some sort of liberation from our current, economic ills by aligning ourselves with a satanic force and an organization that literally will promote demoniac values in our society, like the European Union. And it's such a strong position. This is just, it's almost radical. And he's not saying Ukraine should side with Russia. He's not saying that. He's just saying Ukraine needs to at least uphold its own values first and foremost. And I think somebody like Metropolitan Anthony Pakanich is just like a beacon of light and like common sense among some of the other crazy opinions. There's two more very interesting stories coming out of Ukraine. One of them is a very notable former Ukrainian archimandrite, and now he's a bishop, but he's been transferred to the Russian church. Bishop Gedeon Charon gave an interview where he revealed when he was a bishop of the Ukrainian church. When Zelensky was elected in 2019, Zelensky actually promised to Metropolitan Onufriy and the other bishops of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that he would convert to Orthodox Christianity if they supported him, which is very surprising. So they said Zelensky would become baptized and he would become an Orthodox Christian in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And he apparently promised, and he broke this promise, which took a lot of Ukrainian Orthodox bishops by surprise in the years of 2020 and so forth and so on. And I mean, really interesting. And basically, Bishop Gideon Charon is just saying that, look, we shouldn't trust Zelensky. He's a liar. He's an oathbreaker, etc. So again, not surprising. Very similar to Kerensky, who pretended to LARP as a member of the Russian Orthodox Church during the February Revolution, attended services, and would have basically demonic convulsions during the liturgy because he couldn't, of course, stand hearing the prayers. And he was, again, the leader of the Russian Freemasons. The other very, again, curious news story from Ukraine arose that, well, whilst you have Pope Leo, for example, banning the SSPX, in all of Europe, and the American conservative Catholic community is up in arms, what's happening with the Uniate Church in Ukraine? They are actually putting up icons and murals to Stepan Bandera, like not with a halo necessarily, but just as the Stepan Bandera cameos being put up in churches all across Western Ukraine. So there's a complete almost Banderization, neo-Nazification of some Uniate, even though the Roman Catholic Church in Ukraine had little to do with that particular movement, but they're basically trying to claim it as their own. So in some ways, Roman Catholicism, its most Crusader-esque aspects, are being militarized by probably NATO and probably by the globalists in the one country where they need to be militarized. Not in Europe, which is being flooded with migrants, Conrad, but in Ukraine, where they need to send young men to the slaughter against the Orthodox Christian Russians. So you can kind of see how, unfortunately, the Roman Catholic Church is as essentially in its Ukrainian aspect, and the Eastern, as they say, the Eastern Catholic right is almost completely subjugated and being weaponized again against the local Ukrainian and Russian population. So it's very telling where the Roman Catholic Church stands on the Ukrainian issue, whilst being super liberal in the rest of Europe and the rest of the world, and being very open to all kinds of, shall we say, counter neo-Nazi movements and counter right-wing. So it's just incredibly hilarious, almost comedic, right, that Pope Leo would even permit such a thing to happen in Eastern Europe. But here we are.
No, again, there's a reason the Uniates and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is illegal in Russia, especially in the new territories. But coming out of Ukraine, some slightly good news. His Eminence Metropolitan Theodosi of Cherkasy, one of the many persecuted hierarchs of the canonical UOC, was released from the hospital on Wednesday after more than 2 weeks. Metropolitan Theodosi has been discharged from the hospital. We thank everyone for their prayers. The Cherkasy Pilgrim Telegram channel reported the much suffering Metropolitan Theodosi was urgently hospitalized on June 22nd on an urgent referral from cardiologists. He has spent years under house arrest on fabricated charges, and his diocese has become a prime target for violent church seizures. The health of many Ukrainian Orthodox Church hierarchs has suffered greatly under the pressure of state persecution, including Metropolitan Theodosi, who suffered a heart attack in July 2024. Moreover, there has been more than one attempt on his life. During the violent seizure of the Archangel Michael Cathedral in Cherkasy in October 2024, His Eminence was struck violently on the head with a wooden stick. Though his Episcopal Klobuk softened the blow, you can see a video of that happening. I've seen it. His Eminence then spent the entire month of December in the hospital after he was poisoned. According to an evaluation performed during his most recent stay in the hospital, Metropolitan Theodosi is suffering from injuries to his cervical spine and head sustained when he was struck during the cathedral seizure. He also suffers from stage 3 chronic arterial hypertension, which specialists say significantly worsened his overall condition. So pray for Metropolitan Theodosi, one of the strongest hierarchs of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. We also heard from Maxim Ostapenko this week, the general director of the state-run Kiev Caves Lavra National Preserve. He said this in an interview on LB Live. He said that the continued presence of the Orthodox monks in the lower Lavra is hampering tourism and public access to the Kiev Caves Lavra. Journalist Sonia Koshkina noted in the interview that when Ostapenko first took over as director of the preserve, he had expressed a goal of transforming the Lavra into a tourist gem rather than as a place of pilgrimage for the faithful of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Ostenko said the ongoing court proceedings over the state's 2023 termination of its lease agreement with the UOC have left the Lower Lavra territory under a restricted regime limiting who can visit the site. This places a huge burden on the problem of tourism and people's access because the lower territory is essentially restricted, Ostapenko said. Ostapenko said the near caves were reopened to worshippers and pilgrims in 2023 free of charge at designated times. However, the far caves remain closed as litigation over the lease termination continues. 3 years after the state's decision to end the agreement, he said 15 judges have recused themselves from the case over that period, and the main proceedings have been repeatedly postponed, most recently to July 22nd. So yeah, 15 judges realized, dang, I don't want to be going down in history as the judge that had the state stealing this monastery from these monks. So yeah, I'm going to recuse myself. So at least even even scummy people that support Ukraine and are judges for this regime, they don't want to go down in history as just the objective villains. So they've been recusing themselves. But speaking of villainous persecutions, this is also from Ortho-Christian here. It says Estonia's Ministry of the Interior has given the Estonian Christian Orthodox Church, which is an autonomous, self-governing church within the Moscow Patriarchate, 6 months to appoint a new metropolitan and cut its ties with His Holiness Patriarch Kirill of Moscow and all Russia, or face potential forced dissolution. The deadline follows the entry into force on June 22nd of amendments to Estonia's Churches and Congregations Act, which bar religious associations in the country from maintaining affiliations with a religious leader based in a foreign country deemed a threat to Estonia's national security, reports ERR, which, again, I think that only applies to Russia. The law was passed by Estonia's parliament on April 9th, 2025. President Alar Karis twice declined to promulgate it before it was passed a third time on September 17th, 2025, after which Karis petitioned the Supreme Court in October, arguing the law was unconstitutional. On June 8th of this year, the Supreme Court ruled that the amendments do not unconstitutionally restrict religious freedom, rejecting Karis's challenge and clearing the way for enforcement. 6 of the court's 17 justices dissented, arguing the law fails to meet constitutional standards of legal clarity. So only 6 out of 17, not great. Tarmo Milets, Secretary General of the Ministry of the Interior, has now sent letters to all religious associations in the country, notifying that they will have until December 28th to bring their activities into compliance with the new requirements. The Interior Minister may otherwise initiate proceedings to forcibly dissolve a non-compliant association. While the letter was sent to all religious accusations, the primary focus is the Estonian Christian Orthodox Church, formerly known as the Estonian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. His Grace Bishop Daniel of Tartu said in a written response that over the next 6 months, the church plans to seek clarity on how the law will be implemented before deciding how to proceed. Ilmo Au, an advisor at the Ministry of the Interior, said the church must first appoint a new metropolitan, since no cleric or member of the church's governing board may be someone whose residence permit was denied renewal on national security grounds in the past 10 years. The church's current leader, His Eminence Metropolitan Evgeny, was required to leave Estonia in early 2024 after the Estonian Internal Security Service claimed that his activities posed a threat to national security. A further obstacle involves removing references to the Moscow Patriarchate from the church's governing documents. Under its current statutes, Patriarch Kirill must approve with his signature all decisions made by the church's General Assembly, including its annual report, budget, and the election of members to the church administration. Tartu University Associate Professor of Church History Prit Rotmets noted that the church's situation is further complicated by a 1993 tomos issued by His Holiness Patriarch Alexei II, which serves as the church's founding document, establishing its rights and defines its place within the hierarchy of the Moscow Patriarchate. The tomos is the source of the requirement that decisions of the church's General Assembly be approved by the Patriarch and the Metropolitan be nominated and confirmed by the Patriarch of Moscow. Rotmet said the church may remove references to its subordination to the Moscow Patriarchate from its statutes, but is unlikely to want to remove references to the tomos itself. Rotmet said the broader process is likely to lead to new legal disputes this winter, with courts having to determine whether the church has genuinely severed its ties with the Russian Orthodox Church and whether grounds exist for forced dissolution. Rotmet also said it is unlikely that the Russian Orthodox Church would agree to release the Estonian Church. However, under the amended Churches and Congregations Act, the Estonian Church is no longer legally required to seek Moscow's approval to make such a decision, according to Au. So, major persecution escalation there in Ukraine. In Estonia, the president of Estonia had done his best to make these laws vetoed and not going into effect, but the judiciary there and the legislature have insisted upon it, and it appears that by December of this year, we might see the complete dissolution of the canonical Orthodox Church in Estonia. And at that point, you have to wonder, should the Moscow Patriarchate let the church go? Should they give them autocephaly of some kind, or what is the protocol here? Before we wrap up with some final stories, I've gotten some alerts here on my phone. Dmitry, I'd love your thoughts on the Estonia situation.
It's been extremely hard. If you can imagine Metropolitan Eugene Reshetnikov, he had to command and basically administer the entire Estonian metropolis and all the churches located, just from a few kilometers away from the city of Pskov-Pechersk. Actually, it was the, Metropolitan Tikhon Shevkunov's old home base in the Pskov-Pechersk monastery, just outside of the Pskova-Chud Lake. Again, this is the lake where, between Russia and Estonia, where, of course, the battle on the ice took place with Alexander Nevsky in the past. And, of course, this is the famous lake. On the Chud Lake, there is the island of Zalit, and that is where future saint and elder Nikolai Guryanov lived, the one who, of course, venerated Rasputin and the Russian royal family even before they were canonized. And again, this is, his home base, and this is a very famous lake and an island. It's all very interesting. A very interesting zone to have this massive territorial and Orthodox Christian dispute. I would also say that Estonia as a land once controlled by Russia. For example, the city of Tartu, named after Yuri of Saint George, the saint the saint of Grand Duke Yaroslav the Wise, the son of Vladimir who baptized the Rus, and of course the grandson of Princess Olga. Like, the Estonian lands were well and truly, let's just say, like, they were integrated with Russia into almost one entity for a very long time. For the Estonian government and the Estonian judiciary to make these strong anti-Orthodox, anti-Christian moves, I think is extremely arrogant. What exactly are they asking? And, the only thing that's really keeping them safe, I suppose, from Russian intervention and Russian reprisals, I would say, any Orthodox Christian government in Russia would, of course, have some very strong words to say against the persecution of the church. And hopefully Lavrov and the other ministers in Russia will say those things very soon, just as they've made comments about the persecution of the church in Ukraine. Is that, look, the fact that Estonia is in NATO, that's the only thing really holding back any sort of, the great slap that Estonia well and truly deserves. Not necessarily its people, but certainly the leadership of Estonia, which are now, again, trying to harass the last remnants of Orthodox Christianity within that land. And Orthodox Christians have suffered so much in Estonia from both the Soviets, partially through Third Reich occupation, but most definitely since the Soviets, and then the liberalization that took place in Estonia since the 1990s. So Orthodoxy has been on a decline in that particular land, and they just wish to, it seems, exacerbate and accelerate it. It's just quite sad. So we need to keep Metropolitan Eugene in our prayers, as he basically has to administer his entire diocese from essentially abroad from the next door monastery.
That's a real tragedy. And again, I think great ill will be meted out on a country that does this. Obviously, we see what's happening to Ukraine, and I think Estonia, whether it means Russia will, be empowered and emboldened by God to go into Estonia and liberate the people there, or they will face other divine punishments. I don't think they should go down this path for their own sake. I'm not making some kind of threat. I'm just saying we know what happens when you go against Christ and his church, right? And of course, this past week, a saint was glorified in Russia, the Church on the Blood in Ekaterinburg. On June 14th, they marked the glorification of a newly canonized new martyr of the Russian Church, bringing the number of names in the synaxis of Ekaterinburg saints to 75. The saint glorified was monk martyr Vladimir Elizarov, a monk who was shot in 1930 after resisting the closure of a church in the Urals. His Eminence Metropolitan Evgeny of Ekaterinburg and Verkhoturye led the services according to the Ekaterinburg diocese. So, new saint seems very appropriate in this era of church seizures in Ukraine. So pray for us. New martyr Vladimir. Great to see more saints added to the choir of which we can ask intercessions from. So with all of that, some final news here before we wrap up this episode. Trump went to Truth Social and said 1,000 missiles are locked and loaded and aimed at the Islamic Republic of Iran, with thousands of more to immediately follow should the Iranian government act on its threat, pronounced in many corners of the globe, to assassinate or attempt to assassinate the sitting president of the United States of America, in this case, me. Orders have already been given, and the U.S. military is ready, willing, and able for a 1-year period of time, subject to extension, to completely decimate and destroy all areas of Iran. Praise be to Allah, President Donald J. Trump. Quite the post there. We then got from Axios words from a U.S. official that says we expect the Iranians to say that every channel in the strait will be open and that it will be toll-free. And then a second U.S. official said there will be harsh consequences if Iran refuses. If it is not their position tomorrow, which this is being recorded on Friday, this means Saturday, it is not going to be a great day for them, the official said. So with all of that here at the end of episode 172 of World War Now, going into the weekend, my prediction is that there will be no negotiations in Jordan, Switzerland, Qatar, anywhere like that, and we will get right back to shooting. And my prediction is if there is some last-minute negotiations cobbled together in one of these places or elsewhere, it won't create any kind of deal or ceasefire that would last any longer than 2 weeks at the most. Anything past the World Cup, I'd wager we're going to get right back into fighting. So that is my prediction going into the weekend. Do you have any thoughts on these latest updates, Dmitry? Any predictions going into the weekend here? Any predictions regarding the prophecies that we discussed so much today? What are your final thoughts on the status of World War III here at the end of this episode?
I think we are on the brink of further escalation. There's no doubt about that, Conrad. I think diplomacy has been rinsed out. There's nothing left really here. And I think even for the Iranians or the Americans really standing in Donald J. Trump's recent comments, I mean, as one of our supporters, Mike, pointed out, it's pretty much his statement there. It almost gives an assurance that Israel will attempt some sort of false flag or, God forbid, an assassination of the president of the United States, as maybe they've tried that in the past of JFK. But it's just very clear that a provocation is all the US will require in order to, as per Trump's words, decimate the entire country of Iran. And yes, these really bold statements about the Straits opening up. I mean, notice it's happening during this weekend. What can we anticipate for the market opening this Monday? It's going to be quite tumultuous, a very intense week, and after the World Cup is over, well and truly, I think this situation can only descend further into chaos, unfortunately. Look, this is just where Israel has brought us, unfortunately, in this great year of 2026 during the Purim War. Things just keep getting worse in the Middle East.
No, that's 100% what's going on. And again, July, we could very well see many of these prophecies fulfilled with the E65 highway, with the potential taking out of Erdogan and all of these other major developments, not to mention, of course, the U.S. deployments towards Iran. So we're going to be keeping a very, very close eye on that. And if you want to keep a close eye on it with us, be sure to subscribe at worldwarnow.co. Get behind the paywall to support the free weekly World War III analysis, as well as get access to hundreds and hundreds of episodes of Ether Hour, including our recent interviews with Rasputin Archive, Alex from Rasputin Archive, talking part 3 of our incredible Rasputin series, interviews with Maria Z, all about digital ID. That was 2 weeks ago. Discussions with Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson, Father Peter Heers, former Defense Minister of Lebanon, Yaqub Saraf, and so many other incredible guests. So get behind the paywall to hear all of that. Especially tune into our episode with Christopher from the Holy Wisdom channel, all about the prophecies of the Orthodox saints, Greece, Turkey, Russia, the islands, how it's all going to go down. So check all of that out behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co. Subscribe to the YouTube channel as well. We want to keep increasing in subscribers there. Leave a comment, like on both of those platforms, wherever you are listening. We want to hear what you think about the ongoing Third World War. Be sure to check us out on Apple Podcasts and Spotify as well. Give us 5 stars. Leave a comment on those episodes too. We like reading those. Be sure to follow us on X at WorldWarNow_. Follow me on X at GnomeRad. Be sure to follow us on Telegram at WorldWarNowTelly to keep up with developments all throughout this weekend and into the week. For World War III, that's where, if the shooting starts, we're going to be posting about it there. So check us out on all of those platforms. Again, antelopehillpublishing.com. Use code WWN for 10% off. And I want to encourage everybody to check out the Ortho-Christian article this week, all about yours truly and my trip to the Donbass. The title will say, "Once You Leave, Everything Feels Fake, an Orthodox Blogger in the Donbass," part 3 of an interview with Conrad Franz. So check that out. Again, worldwarnow.co is the home base where you can make sure that you're getting up to date on everything and supporting the show. So with all of that, thank you all for making it here to the end of the episode, and we will see you on the next one. God bless.